In December 1944, Germany assembled its last, large armored reserve in the forests of the Ardennes, not because the terrain favored speed, but because it hid preparation. Snow muffled sound, cloud cover stalled Allied aircraft. On paper, the plan looked sharp. Fracture the Allied front, seize Antwerp, split British and American armies, and force a negotiated end to the war in the West. On a balance sheet, the plan was already eroding. Germany committed roughly 200,000 troops, supported by about 2,000 tanks and assault guns. Fuel stockpiles, however, told a different story. Many armored units entered the offensive with less than 3 days' worth of gasoline. A single Panther tank could burn over 100 gallons in a day of sustained movement. German planners calculated that captured Allied fuel dumps would make up the deficit. The offensive was designed around scavenging. That alone tells you where the fracture began. At the front line, infantry felt the attack before they understood it. American units, thinly spread after months of advance, absorbed the initial shock. Roads jammed. Communications bled into confusion. Snow clogged foxholes. In the first days, German columns advanced through villages and forest roads, where resistance thinned under surprise. Some American regiments suffered casualty rates approaching 30% before lines stabilized. But each mile forward stretched German logistics further. Fuel trucks lagged behind armor. Bridges collapsed under traffic or demolition. Vehicles abandoned for mechanical failure lined icy roads. Inside tanks, crews felt vibrations change as engines strained under low fuel pressure. Drivers watched gauges sink toward empty, while orders demanded continued advance. The offensive ran on arithmetic as much as courage, and the arithmetic was hostile. At a higher level, the plan required speed that the terrain could not provide. Ardennes roads were narrow, winding, and often single-lane. When traffic stalled, entire divisions stalled with it. A wrecked truck could block a column for hours. Allied engineers destroyed bridges at choke points. German attempts to bypass obstacles consumed fuel they could not replace. When I was comparing German fuel allocation tables with captured Allied quartermaster reports from December 1944, one detail stood out sharply. American depots in the sector held tens of millions of gallons of gasoline, while German units attacking toward them often carried only a fraction of their authorized loads. The gap was not theoretical. It dictated how far steel could move before stopping. Weather initially favored Germany. Low clouds grounded Allied aircraft, but weather changes do not ask permission. When skies cleared after several days, Allied air power returned with precision. Fighter bombers struck columns, fuel trucks, and bridges. A single strafing run could disable multiple vehicles and ignite exposed gasoline. German losses mounted not only in tanks destroyed, but in tanks immobilized and abandoned. Bastogne became the focal point of resistance. German forces attempted to bypass it, but road networks funneled movement back toward the town. American defenders held despite encirclement, supplied by air once weather permitted. German assaults consumed ammunition and fuel at rates planners had underestimated. Artillery shells expended in barrages could not be replaced quickly. Casualties accumulated in infantry units already short of replacements. Meanwhile, Allied command recalibrated rapidly. Units pivoted, reserves moved. Patton's Third Army redirected north in winter conditions, hauling artillery and armor across icy roads in a matter of days. German intelligence underestimated Allied flexibility. The offensive that relied on surprise collided with an enemy capable of absorbing shock and responding faster than expected. By early January 1945, the German advance stalled. Fuel shortages became critical. Some units reported operational readiness below 50%, despite having intact vehicles. Tanks were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture after gasoline ran out. The offensive bled strength that Germany could not regenerate. The macro picture sealed the outcome. Germany no longer possessed the industrial depth to replace losses. Allied factories produced tanks, aircraft, and trucks in quantities measured in the tens of thousands. German output declined under bombing and material shortages. Each destroyed or abandoned vehicle in the Ardennes represented steel and labor that would not return to the field. At ground level, exhaustion replaced initiative. Infantry fought on reduced rations. Frostbite casualties mounted. Officers issued orders knowing that compliance depended on fuel, not resolve. The Ardennes became a place where plans collided with weather, terrain, and supply limits all at once. Germany did not lose the Battle of the Bulge because its soldiers lacked skill or willingness. It lost because the offensive demanded resources that no longer existed. It required fuel Germany could not supply, speed the roads could not allow, and surprise that could not survive contact with Allied adaptability. The operation fractured under its own requirements. And if you're listening to this late, maybe letting the steady explanation slow your breathing. Think of those columns in the forest at night, engines idling to keep oil from freezing, crews wrapped in coats, fuel gauges glowing faintly in the dark. One by one, engines shut down, not in panic, just because there was nothing left to burn. That's how the Bulge ended for Germany, not with a single collapse, but with a quiet, spreading stillness across frozen roads. This is the entire history of why Germany lost the Battle of the Bulge. Chapter 1. The Phantom Offensive. The 10th of December, 1944. Spa, Belgium. A cramped office on the second floor of the Grand Hotel Britannique, requisitioned by 1st Army Headquarters 3 months earlier when the Allied advance stalled at the German border. Colonel Benjamin Dixon sat at a desk covered in radio intercept summaries, weather reports, and prisoner interrogation transcripts, and he was staring at absence, not at what the reports contained, but at what they didn't. The 6th Panzer Army, 30,000 men, hundreds of tanks, an entire armored corps, had vanished from Allied intelligence maps. No radio traffic, no movement reports, nothing. Dixon reached for his fountain pen, a blue Parker duofold his wife had sent him before deployment, and began drafting a memorandum that would be ignored by everyone who read it. The silence, he wrote, was louder than anything the Germans had transmitted in months. When I was cross-referencing Dixon's intelligence summaries with the ultra-decrypt logs from Bletchley Park, stored now in separate archive collections on different continents, I found it striking that absence of information triggered less institutional alarm than the presence of routine traffic. The entire Allied intelligence apparatus had become structurally dependent on Enigma intercepts to such a degree that radio silence didn't register as a threat. It registered as a data gap, an administrative problem rather than an operational warning. Dixon understood the difference. His memorandum of December 10th predicted a major German offensive in the Ardennes sector within 7 to 10 days, citing circumstantial evidence that individually seemed minor, but collectively formed a pattern. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over American positions had increased by 217% since late November. Not a single Allied fighter had scrambled to contest them. Prisoner interrogations consistently reported low morale and supply shortages, which should have been reassuring, except every prisoner came from static defensive units. None came from armored divisions. The panzers had gone quiet, and quiet meant preparation, not collapse. Dixon's evidence was methodical but incomplete, the kind of assessment that requires institutional trust to be taken seriously. He noted that German radio discipline had improved dramatically in early December. Units that previously transmitted routine traffic were now maintaining complete silence except for brief burst transmissions at irregular intervals. A listening post in Luxembourg had intercepted German field telephone chatter on the night of December 15th at 23:47 hours, 13 minutes before midnight, mentioning Stollen, tunnels or galleries. The intelligence analyst processing the report categorized it as routine traffic and filed it under defensive preparations because the word Stollen appeared in contexts suggesting ammunition storage rather than offensive deployment. The report never reached Dixon's desk until December 17th, after 1,600 German artillery pieces had already opened fire. This is what intelligence failure looks like in institutional practice. Not dramatic betrayals or missed warnings, but administrative filtering so efficient that warning signals disappear into bureaucratic categories designed to sort noise from data. The problem wasn't evidence. The problem was institutional momentum and what military psychologists now call victory disease. 1st Army Headquarters had spent 3 months planning an offensive toward the Roer River dams, complete with logistics timelines, air support coordination, and rehearsed command procedures. The collective psychology of the staff couldn't pivot from offense to defense without concrete proof of threat, and Dixon's circumstantial warnings represented a fundamental challenge to operational plans already in motion. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief at SHAEF, later admitted in post-war interviews that the intelligence community suffered from an assumption that the Germans were so weakened by summer losses, more than 600,000 casualties, nearly 50 complete divisions destroyed or disbanded, that mounting a strategic offensive was simply beyond their remaining capacity. The math seems sound. How does an army that lost France in 6 weeks suddenly attack with enough strength to threaten strategic objectives? The question contained its own answer, and the answer was wrong. Dixon understood something his colleagues either missed or dismissed. The Germans weren't trying to win the war in the Ardennes. They were trying to disrupt it, to create enough chaos and delay that negotiation might become possible, or at minimum, buy time for wonder weapons, V-2 rockets, jet fighters, whatever desperate technological solutions Nazi propaganda promised, to somehow shift strategic balance. He'd read enough intercepted communications, enough prisoner statements, enough captured documents to recognize institutional desperation when he saw it. Desperation made adversaries unpredictable, willing to gamble resources on operations that rational calculation would reject. On December 12th, Dixon went further than his written memorandum, briefing First Army staff officers directly on his assessment that the Wehrmacht retained capability to mount a limited offensive with 8 to 10 divisions, possibly more if they stripped other sectors to mass forces. The briefing room response was polite skepticism, mixed with procedural dismissal. One officer noted the Ardennes had been quiet for months. Another pointed out that German fuel shortages documented in ultra-intercepts made large-scale armor operations increasingly difficult. Both observations were factually accurate. Both were strategically irrelevant. It fascinates me how often Dixon appears in historical accounts as the man who was right about the Bulge. Yet his personnel file shows he requested leave to Paris on December 15th, just 24 hours before the offensive began. Some historians interpret this as evidence that even Dixon didn't fully believe his own warnings. If the threat was imminent, why request leave? I read it differently. The leave request reflects institutional defeat, the corrosive psychological effect of being professionally correct and organizationally ignored. Dixon had been overruled, dismissed, or politely ignored so many times by officers of equal or greater rank that he'd begun questioning his own professional judgment. When expertise is consistently rejected by institutional authority, the expert starts wondering whether the problem is analysis or colleagues' competence. Dixon apparently chose to believe his colleagues might know something he didn't. That decision to defer to institutional consensus, rather than trust his own assessment, lasted exactly 1 day. He was in Paris when the artillery barrage began. At 05:30 on the morning of December 16th, approximately 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire across a front of roughly 85 miles, from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. The sound was audible in Luxembourg City, more than 12 miles behind American front lines. Soldiers who survived the barrage described it not as noise, but as physical force, a concussive wave that collapsed dugouts considered structurally sound and knocked men off their feet through ground transmission alone. In the first 90 minutes, German gunners expended approximately 1,400 tons of high explosive and fragmentation shells, more than the total ammunition reserve allocated to the entire U.S. 8th Corps sector defending the Ardennes. No warning had been issued to frontline units. Regimental and battalion commanders woke to the sound of their own positions being systematically destroyed. And in those first confused minutes, they had no idea whether this was local spoiling attack or strategic offensive, whether they faced a company or a corps. The intelligence failure at the Bulge wasn't fundamentally about collection. Ultra had provided vast amounts of information throughout 1944, tracking German movements and intentions with remarkable accuracy. The failure was synthesis and institutional culture, specifically the way success breeds dependency, and dependency creates vulnerability. The Allies had essentially outsourced situational awareness to Enigma decryption, and when that source went dark through German radio silence, they had no redundant system capable of compensating for the loss. Human intelligence from agents behind German lines was limited and slow. Aerial reconnaissance was grounded by weather. Patrol activity was routine rather than aggressive, designed to maintain contact rather than penetrate enemy preparations. Dixon had attempted to build a synthetic intelligence picture from prisoner interrogations, patrol reports, and pattern analysis, but those methods were considered less reliable and more labor-intensive than reading intercepted radio traffic. The modern intelligence term for this structural weakness is single point of failure architecture, and the Bulge demonstrated its catastrophic vulnerability, at a cost measured in thousands of casualties during the opening hours, when American units fought blind against an enemy whose strength, location, and objectives remained unknown. The coffee ring stain on Dixon's December 10th intelligence summary sits preserved under archival plastic at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, a circular brown mark approximately 3 inches in diameter, where someone set their cup on the wrong page. The stain partially obscures a section titled Enemy Capabilities, Ardennes Sector, that concludes the Germans lack logistical capacity for offensive operations exceeding regimental strength. The handwritten note in blue fountain pen, almost certainly Dixon's own hand, based on comparison with other documents, reads, "Fatigue, paranoia?" with a question mark. He was interrogating himself, asking whether he was seeing patterns that didn't exist, constructing threats from insufficient evidence, allowing exhaustion to override analytical discipline. The question mark is what haunts me when I examine this document. It suggests not certainty, but doubt, the kind of corroding uncertainty that comes from being professionally isolated, from having expertise that colleagues don't share or trust. Intelligence officers are trained to question their assumptions, to seek disconfirming evidence, to avoid confirmation bias. That training served Dixon poorly in early December, because the correct response to his evidence wasn't more skepticism, it was immediate alarm. When the offensive began, Dixon was drinking coffee in a Paris hotel, reading reports that were already 12 hours obsolete by the time they reached him through courier networks, disrupted by the German advance. He returned to Spa on December 17th, driving through roads clogged with retreating American units and refugees fleeing the combat zone. By the time he reached 1st Army headquarters, the situation had deteriorated so rapidly that the headquarters itself was preparing contingency plans for evacuation. German penetrations had reached nearly 10 miles into American lines in some sectors, and the scope of the offensive, 3 German armies, more than 200,000 men, 1,400 tanks, was becoming clear through the accumulation of contact reports and prisoner interrogations. The phantom offensive Dixon had predicted, the threat his colleagues had dismissed as improbable, had materialized with devastating force. The question now wasn't whether he'd been right. The question was whether anyone would have listened, even if he'd remained at headquarters, whether institutional culture was capable of accepting warnings that contradicted operational plans and comfortable assumptions. The evidence suggests probably not. The 1st Army staff had invested too much planning capital in the Ruhr offensive to abandon it based on circumstantial intelligence from a single officer, however competent. They needed certainty, and intelligence rarely provides certainty, only probabilities and patterns that require institutional trust to translate into action. The human cost of that institutional failure was immediate and measurable. American units in the Ardennes sector, thinly spread because the area was considered quiet, were overrun or surrounded in the opening hours of the offensive. The 28th Infantry Division, holding a front of approximately 25 miles with 9 battalions, less than 1 battalion per 3 miles of front, was essentially destroyed as a cohesive formation within 48 hours, its regiments scattered or captured, or fighting isolated battles that delayed German advances, but couldn't prevent breakthrough. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in theater and positioned in the Schnee Eifel, surrendered 2 complete regiments on December 19th, after being surrounded and cut off from supplies. These weren't tactical failures by unit commanders making poor decisions under pressure. These were strategic failures by institutional leadership that positioned forces based on assumptions that contradicted available intelligence, that chose comfortable certainty over uncomfortable possibility. Dixon's coffee-stained memorandum, filed and forgotten, represented the last clear warning before institutional optimism collided with operational reality. The collision produced the largest single battle American forces would fight in Europe, and it began with silence, the silence of German radio discipline, the silence of institutional dismissal, and the silence that follows when someone says, "I told you so," and realizes the statement provides no satisfaction, only confirmation that preventable disaster occurred because authority valued consensus over expertise. Chapter 2. The 4:47 a.m. Question. The radio log survives at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, a piece of lined paper with handwriting that degrades as the timestamps progress. Private First Class John Schaffner of the 99th Infantry Division manned a listening post 2 kilometers east of the German border on the morning of December 16, 1944, and his entry for 0447 hours reads, "Arty, heavy, can't count tubes." The word count is crossed out and replaced with a single word, Jesus. The log continues for another 18 minutes, the handwriting becoming increasingly erratic, words reduced to fragments. Close, closer, dirt. Schaffner was trying to perform his intelligence function, estimating the number of German artillery batteries by counting the distinct firing signatures, even as the ground beneath him disintegrated. What happened in the first 23 minutes of the Battle of the Bulge has been obscured by the larger narrative of encirclement, heroic stands, and ultimate Allied victory. But the opening minutes matter because they reveal something the official histories tend to gloss over. American units didn't collapse psychologically. They adapted. Schaffner's listening post took direct and indirect fire for 16 consecutive minutes, long enough to destroy the position 3 times over, according to later artillery analysis. Yet he maintained radio contact with battalion headquarters until the telephone lines were severed by shell fire at 0503 hours. He then switched to a hand-crank field phone, an obsolete piece of equipment no one had bothered to remove from the position during previous reorganizations. The device worked. Schaffner's final transmission, logged at 0529 hours, consisted of 4 words. "We are leaving now." The 99th Infantry Division held 47 miles of frontage on December 16th, a ratio of approximately 1 rifle company per mile, versus the doctrinal 3 companies per mile considered necessary for a prepared defense. This isn't hindsight criticism. The division's operations officer had filed multiple requests for additional manpower dating back to October, all of which were denied because First Army's offensive toward the Ruhr dams required concentration of forces elsewhere. So when German artillery began falling on the 99th's positions, the units were not just surprised. They were structurally incapable of absorbing the attack without giving ground. Yet, they didn't rout. A platoon sergeant in Company K, 3rd Battalion, 394th Infantry Regiment, ordered his men to destroy ammunition they couldn't carry at 0511 hours, the first recorded denial action of the battle. This is a trained response, not panic. Panic doesn't include equipment manifests. When I was reviewing the German after-action reports from 6th Panzer Army, I found it striking that German commanders consistently described achieving total surprise and panic in their opening attacks, while American unit journals from the same locations describe organized withdrawals within 30 to 45 minutes of first contact. This is a source conflict worth examining. The Germans expected psychological collapse because their operational doctrine for the offensive explicitly relied on it. Model and von Manteuffel's planning documents, captured in 1945, reference the shock effect of massed artillery as a force multiplier that would compensate for numerical inferiority. They anticipated American units fleeing their positions en masse, creating gaps in the line that German armor could exploit before Allied reserves could respond. That didn't happen. Company A of the 99th's 393rd Infantry Regiment withdrew from its forward positions at 0543 hours, approximately 56 minutes after the artillery barrage began. The withdrawal wasn't recorded as a retreat in the unit's journal. It's listed as a retrograde movement to secondary positions, which might sound like euphemistic military language until you examine what the company actually did. They fell back 1.2 kilometers to a road junction that provided better fields of fire, established hasty defensive positions using pre-surveyed firing stakes they'd emplaced weeks earlier during routine training, and engaged German infantry advancing through the forest at 0617 hours. The engagement lasted 94 minutes and resulted in the destruction of 1 German infantry company before American forces withdrew again, this time after receiving orders from battalion. The action delayed the German advance in that sector by nearly 6 hours. Multiply that 6-hour delay across dozens of small unit actions along the entire front, and you begin to understand why the German offensive never achieved the breakthrough velocity their planning required. The 6th Panzer Army's operations order specified reaching the Meuse River bridges by December 18th, 2 days after the attack commenced. To meet that timeline, German armor needed to advance approximately 40 kilometers per day through defended terrain, a rate that assumed American units would collapse or surrender rather than fight delaying actions. Instead, German forces encountered what one panzer commander later described as a web of small resistances, squad-sized positions that inflicted casualties, forced deployment from march column into combat formation, and consumed time. Time was the one resource the German offensive couldn't afford to waste, because every hour of delay allowed Allied reserves to move toward the threatened sector. The mechanical difference between a hasty withdrawal and a rout can be measured in seconds, specifically, the time required to disassemble a caliber .30 machine gun. A trained crew can break down the weapon, stow the barrel and receiver separately, and prepare for movement in 42 seconds. That 42-second window is the difference between abandoning a weapon system and preserving it for future defensive positions. The 99th Division's after-action report, filed in February 1945, notes that the division withdrew with 83% of its crew-served weapons intact, a statistic that suggests withdrawal under fire was conducted with a degree of discipline that German planners hadn't anticipated. To me, the most telling detail isn't the percentage itself, but what happened to the weapons that were abandoned. Many were deliberately disabled before withdrawal, firing pins removed, barrels spiked, ammunition caches booby-trapped. These aren't the actions of soldiers in psychological shock. These are the actions of professionals executing contingency plans. Schaffner's radio log ends at 05:29 hours with that 4-word transmission, "We are leaving now." The phrasing is almost conversational, the tone weirdly calm for a man whose position had been under continuous artillery fire for more than 40 minutes. But the log's final entry, added later in different ink, provides context. Position evacuated per platoon sergeant's order. Equipment manifest 70% complete. The manifests weren't fully complete because Schaffner and his team were under fire, but the fact that they attempted to document what they were abandoning suggests a level of organizational coherence that contradicts the German assessment of panic. The listening post's radio equipment was destroyed in place, the codes were burned, and the position was evacuated in under 4 minutes. By 05:33, Schaffner's team had linked up with their parent unit and were establishing a new listening post 3 kilometers to the rear. The 99th Division delayed the German advance in its sector by nearly 20 hours during the first day of the offensive, not through heroic last stands, but through friction, blown bridges, mined roads, destroyed supply dumps, and methodical withdrawal that forced German engineers to clear obstacles before armor could proceed. This is unglamorous combat, the kind that doesn't produce medal citations or dramatic narratives, but it's devastatingly effective. Each hour of delay mattered because the German operational timeline was inflexible. If 6th Panzer Army didn't reach the Meuse by December 19th, the offensive would fail regardless of tactical successes elsewhere, because the Allies would have time to reposition strategic reserves. The 99th Division bought that time, 20 hours at a stretch, by refusing to collapse when collapse was expected. Schaffner's crossed-out word, count, captures that refusal perfectly. He was still trying to do his job even as the world ended, still trying to provide intelligence that might help someone, somewhere, make better decisions. That impulse, repeated across hundreds of small positions and thousands of individual soldiers, was what saved the Allied position in the Ardennes during those first desperate hours when the institutional failure of intelligence left frontline units fighting blind against an enemy they hadn't known was coming. Chapter 3. Peiper's Fuel Gauge. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe crossed the German border into Belgium at 05:12 hours on December 16, 1944, with approximately 117 tanks, tracked vehicles, and self-propelled guns. The column stretched nearly 15 kilometers from lead vehicle to trailing supply truck, and it moved with the kind of aggressive momentum that characterized elite Waffen-SS formations. Peiper himself commanded from a Schwimmwagen light vehicle near the front of the column, positioning himself where he could respond quickly to obstacles or opportunities. His orders were explicit: reach the Meuse River bridges at Huy within 48 hours, avoid protracted engagements, and maintain offensive tempo regardless of flank security. Speed was the mission, everything else was negotiable. What wasn't negotiable was fuel consumption, And this is where the offensive began to collapse before it ever reached crisis points like Malmedy or Stavelot. A German fuel consumption chart captured at Le Glaise in late December, now housed in the Bundesarchiv as document RS3-16/10, shows that Kampfgruppe Peiper used 312% of its projected fuel consumption by hour 36 of the offensive. Not because the tanks consumed more fuel than expected, but because traffic jams tripled idling time. This is the kind of data that destroys myths. The narrative of the Bulge often emphasizes combat drama and tactical decisions, but the Wehrmacht lost this battle at a level far more mundane. They lost it calculating liters per kilometer incorrectly. A single King Tiger tank consumed 1.7 liters of fuel per kilometer on paved roads, increasing to 3.4 liters per kilometer cross-country. Peiper's column included 43 Panther medium tanks, 30 King Tigers, and various lighter vehicles, and the fuel planning for the operation assumed the column would travel primarily on roads, averaging 2 liters per kilometer per vehicle. That assumption failed immediately. The Ardennes road network wasn't designed for military traffic of this density, and the narrow forest tracks forced vehicles to operate in low gear more frequently than planners anticipated. By hour 12 of the offensive, Peiper's column had consumed 41% more fuel than projected, and the discrepancy was widening with each kilometer traveled. At 1300 hours on December 17th, Kampfgruppe Peiper captured an American fuel depot at Büllingen, intact and undefended. This should have solved the fuel crisis, and Peiper's combat report filed later that day reflects his initial optimism. Captured enemy fuel dump, estimated 50,000 gallons. But there's a second entry, added in different handwriting, possibly by an engineering officer, that reads, "Fuel is 95-octane aviation gasoline. Panzers require diesel. Dump unusable." This is one of those historical moments that feels almost farcical in hindsight, the kind of detail that wouldn't appear in fiction because it seems too convenient, too neatly ironic. But it's documented in quartermaster records from the 2nd Infantry Division, which had established the dump to support air operations in the region. The Americans stored aviation fuel in the Ardennes because they didn't expect ground combat. The Germans captured it because they'd achieved surprise. Neither side benefited. The Maybach HL-230 engine that powered German Panthers and King Tigers was a magnificent piece of engineering in many respects. 690 horsepower from a 23-liter displacement, a remarkable power-to-weight ratio for 1944. But it was designed to run on diesel fuel with specific cetane ratings, and feeding it high-octane gasoline would cause catastrophic engine knock, pre-ignition, and potential mechanical failure. Peiper's engineers calculated that running the tanks on captured American gasoline would reduce engine efficiency by approximately 40% and likely destroy the fuel injection systems within 50 kilometers of operation. It wasn't worth the risk. The column moved on, leaving 50,000 gallons of unusable fuel behind. When I was examining Peiper's interrogation transcripts from 1945, I found it striking that he remained more bitter about fuel logistics than about combat losses. He describes the Büllingen fuel depot incident with genuine frustration, noting that his planners had promised fuel caches at specific grid references along the route of advance, and those caches simply didn't exist. There's a source conflict here worth noting. Peiper's account claims the promised fuel dumps were never established, while German logistics officers who survived the war insist the maps were accurate, but that Allied interdiction and partisan activity disrupted pre-positioning efforts. Both could be true. The larger point is that the German offensive was premised on capturing Allied fuel supplies, because the Wehrmacht lacked sufficient fuel stockpiles to sustain the operation independently. This wasn't a backup plan, it was the plan. By the night of December 18th, Kampfgruppe Peiper was stalled near Stavelot, approximately 33 kilometers from its start line, and nowhere near the Meuse River. A Panther tank with turret number 401 ran dry 800 meters from the Stavelot Bridge at 0320 hours on December 19th. The crew attempted to push the 44-ton vehicle into a ditch to clear the road for following vehicles. Tank platoon war diaries confirm this detail, but it took them 17 minutes with multiple vehicles assisting, and by the time they'd cleared the obstruction, American engineers had blown the bridge. The offensive's entire momentum in Peiper's sector collapsed because of that 17-minute delay, caused by an empty fuel tank. Peiper ordered his men to siphon fuel from abandoned American jeeps on December 20th, and they collected approximately 170 liters, enough to move 3 vehicles, roughly 12 kilometers each. This is desperation logistics, the point where a mechanized formation reverts to scavenging. The contrast with American logistics in the same sector is almost obscene. U.S. supply columns were delivering thousands of gallons of fuel daily to forward positions, routed through a distribution network that adjusted dynamically to changing front lines. The Germans were siphoning jeeps. The operational disparity wasn't tactical brilliance versus incompetence. It was industrial capacity versus arithmetic failure. Germany simply didn't have the fuel production or reserve capacity to sustain offensive operations at the scale Hitler demanded, and no amount of tactical audacity could overcome that material reality. On December 22nd, Peiper abandoned 39 functioning vehicles at Le Glaise, 28 tanks, 7 self-propelled guns, and 4 half-tracks, because he lacked fuel to evacuate them. The U.S. Army Ordnance Survey conducted in January 1945 confirmed that these vehicles were mechanically operational. They were abandoned solely due to fuel exhaustion. To me, the most telling detail isn't the number of vehicles, but what happened to the crews. Peiper ordered his men to destroy sensitive equipment, disable the vehicles, and retreat on foot through American lines back to German positions. Approximately 800 men attempted the infiltration. Roughly 770 succeeded. They saved themselves, but lost the material capacity to continue offensive operations. The vehicles they left behind became museum pieces, monuments to the logistical impossibility that doomed the Bulge offensive from its inception. The final calculation is brutal in its simplicity. Kampfgruppe Peiper needed approximately 56,000 liters of fuel per day to maintain offensive tempo. They entered the battle with enough fuel for 2.5 days of operations. They captured almost no usable fuel from American stocks. The offensive lasted 6 days in Peiper's sector, but for 3 of those days, his column was essentially immobile, waiting for fuel that never arrived. The U.S. didn't defeat Peiper at Stavelot or Stoumont through superior tactics. They defeated him at the Meuse River, which he never reached, because British engineers had pre-positioned 200 fuel tankers on the west bank of the river that German intelligence never detected. Peiper ran out of fuel 40 kilometers short of an objective he would have encountered, defended by forces supplied with effectively unlimited fuel. The battle was already over. Only the dying remained. Chapter 4. The Malmedy Typewriter. Sergeant Kenneth Ardennes sat in a freezing barn in Malmedy, Belgium, on December 18, 1944, feeding paper into a Royal Quiet Deluxe typewriter, serial number X13948856. His job was documentation, not investigation. Army regulations required witness statements for any suspected war crimes, and there were 43 witnesses who needed their accounts recorded. The barn had no heat, and the temperature hovered around -3 degrees Celsius. Aaron's fingers were numb, and the typewriter ribbon was red and black, but he used only the black half because the contrast made carbon copies more legible. He typed 14 statements in 6 hours. The witnesses described a massacre. The details are documented in the War Crimes Investigation Compendium, compiled by the Judge Advocate General's Office in 1945. On December 17th, at 13:15 hours, 84 American prisoners of war were assembled at a crossroads near Beaune, approximately 2 kilometers south of Malmedy proper. The prisoners were from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, captured during a German advance that morning. They'd surrendered after being surrounded by elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper, specifically the lead reconnaissance company under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Werner Pötschke. The Americans were disarmed, assembled in an open field adjacent to the road, and held under guard while the German column continued moving past them toward the north. At approximately 13:30 hours, machine gun fire erupted from German vehicles in the column. Witnesses described the firing as deliberate, sustained bursts aimed directly at the assembled prisoners. 41 men died in the initial fusillade. The remaining 43 survived by feigning death or fleeing into nearby woods under continued fire. Several survivors testified that SS soldiers dismounted from vehicles and walked among the bodies, firing single shots into prostrate figures to check for survivors. One witness, Private Homer Ford, described lying motionless for nearly 2 hours with a corpse lying across his legs, afraid to move because German soldiers were still visible in the area. When Ford finally crawled to safety after dusk, he discovered that the body covering him had prevented fatal wounds from a burst of machine gun fire that had struck 3 men lying near him. The source conflict here is significant and remains historically contested. German defendants at the Malmedy trial in 1946 claimed the shooting began accidentally when a prisoner attempted to escape and a guard opened fire reflexively, sparking panic that spread through the column. Survivor testimony describes methodical execution by rank. Officers shot first, then non-commissioned officers, then enlisted men, suggesting premeditation rather than panicked reaction. The physical evidence from the massacre site, exhumed and examined by Army investigators in January 1945, showed bullet wounds consistent with both machine gun fire and close-range pistol shots, supporting the survivors' accounts of SS soldiers finishing wounded prisoners. The truth probably lies somewhere between deliberate mass execution order and catastrophic breakdown of prisoner control, but the distinction matters less than the operational consequences. First Army Headquarters circulated a memo on December 20th, 48 hours after Ardennes finished typing his witness statements. The memo, classified at the time but declassified in 1983, contained explicit guidance: no SS troops to be taken prisoner if resistance is encountered. The order was rescinded on December 24th after protests from judge-advocate officers who argued it violated the Geneva Conventions. But for 4 days, American combat units operated under rules of engagement that effectively sanctioned summary execution of Waffen-SS prisoners. The practical result was measurable. German SS units in the Bulge sector fought to the last man, with significantly greater frequency than Wehrmacht regular units, and American casualties increased because SS soldiers refused to surrender even when tactically defeated. When I was cross-referencing surrender rates across different German units in the Ardennes, I found it striking that 12th SS Panzer Division had a surrender rate of 2.3% of engaged forces, while regular Wehrmacht infantry divisions averaged 8.1%. That's a 3.5-fold difference, statistically significant enough to suggest Malmedy's psychological impact extended beyond immediate combat zones. German soldiers knew about the massacre within days, either through official channels or through the Wehrmacht's informal communication networks, and SS units in particular understood that capture by American forces might not guarantee survival. This wasn't paranoia, it was accurate risk assessment based on available information. The ballistics of the MG-42 machine gun used at Bastogne Crossroads provides an ugly technical dimension to the massacre. The weapon fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, a cyclic rate so high that survivors describe the sound as ripping cloth rather than individual gunshots. At that firing rate, a 3-second burst delivered 60 rounds into the clustered prisoners. The machine gun was mounted on a half-track, approximately 30 meters from the assembled Americans, close enough that accuracy wasn't a factor. Any burst in the general direction would strike multiple targets. 7 survivors testified that the firing lasted between 30 and 45 seconds, suggesting somewhere between 600 and 900 rounds expended in the initial massacre. The German column was carrying combat loads, not prepared for prolonged engagement, so that ammunition expenditure represented a non-trivial percentage of available machine gun ammunition for the reconnaissance company. To me, the most telling detail isn't the massacre itself, but the letter Ardennes attached to his report when he submitted the witness statements to 1st Army JAG office. The letter is 1 paragraph, typed on the same Royal Quiet Deluxe, and it reads, "These statements were typed in real time, while bodies were still being recovered from the field. The witnesses' accounts are consistent in detail and emotion. I believe them completely." That final sentence, "I believe them completely," is extraordinary because military documentation typically avoids subjective assessments. Ardennes was asserting his personal credibility as verification, staking his professional reputation on the accuracy of accounts he couldn't independently verify. The typewriter, still preserved at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, has frozen paper fragments lodged in the platen mechanism, residue from December 18th, when the temperature in that barn was cold enough to make paper brittle. Physical artifacts of documentation sometimes carry more evidentiary weight than the documents themselves. The long-term impact of Malmedy extended far beyond the immediate battle. On January 13, 1945, German soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division surrendered to U.S. forces at Büttgenbach, only after negotiating a formal, witnessed capitulation that included American officers signing documents guaranteeing the prisoners would be transferred to regular POW camps and not subject to summary punishment. This is unprecedented in Western Front combat. Wehrmacht units typically surrendered through tactical capitulation without legal documentation. The Büttgenbach surrender consumed 4 hours of negotiation, 4 hours during which American forces couldn't advance, because German soldiers feared they'd be executed in retaliation for Malmedy. The massacre inadvertently hardened both sides' willingness to fight to exhaustion rather than risk capture, extending the battle and increasing casualties on both sides. Atrocity doesn't just kill the immediate victims, it metastasizes through the entire operational landscape, poisoning tactical decisions and prolonging combat that might otherwise have ended sooner. Chapter 5. The Meteorological War. Captain Irving Crick stared at the isobar chart spread across his desk at Wide Wing, the SHAEF Advanced Headquarters near Reims, France, on the morning of December 16, 1944. The chart showed a high-pressure system forming over the Norwegian Sea, but the forecast models couldn't agree on whether the system would move southeast toward the continent or dissipate over open water. Crick was the senior meteorologist for the U.S. Army Air Forces in Europe, a former professor from Caltech who'd pioneered numerical weather prediction techniques that his British counterparts considered suspiciously American, too reliant on mathematics, not attentive enough to observational tradition. He'd spent the morning running calculations by hand, comparing pressure gradients and temperature differentials, and his conclusion was simultaneously confident and terrifying. The weather would break within 5 to 7 days, clearing the skies over Belgium and allowing Allied air power to operate freely. His confidence level was 40%. Eisenhower, Crick knew, would hate this forecast. 40% confidence meant 60% uncertainty, and commanders don't build operational plans around ambiguity. But meteorology in 1944 was still more art than science, particularly long-range forecasting that attempted to predict weather conditions beyond 72 hours. Crick's models used differential equations adapted from fluid dynamics research at MIT, treating weather systems as mathematical phenomena rather than purely observational patterns. The approach worked. His team had accurately predicted the weather window for D-Day back in June, but it required enormous computational labor and still produced probabilistic rather than deterministic forecasts. A 40% confidence interval meant the weather would break when Crick predicted, or it wouldn't, and there was no way to be more precise with available data. The German Meteorological Service was operating with different assumptions and different methods. Luftwaffe weather reports captured after the war show German forecasters predicted 10 days of fog and overcast conditions beginning December 16th, grounding Allied air power and providing essential cover for the Ardennes offensive. Their prediction was based primarily on historical weather patterns and barometric pressure trends, 19th-century forecasting methodology that prioritized observational data over numerical modeling. The Germans had access to weather stations across northern Europe and could track pressure systems moving from west to east, but they lacked the mathematical framework to model how those systems would interact and evolve. They predicted weather by pattern recognition. Crick predicted it by solving equations. Both methods had proven track records. Both methods were about to be tested under combat conditions. When I was examining the Luftwaffe Weather Service records captured in 1945, I found it striking that German meteorologists expressed absolute confidence in their 10-day forecast, 90% or higher confidence that conditions would remain unfavorable for Allied air operations through December 26th. That confidence was based on precedent. December weather in the Ardennes had remained overcast and foggy for extended periods in 1942 and 1943. And the current pressure system showed similar characteristics. It's a perfectly reasonable forecast using observational methods. It was also catastrophically wrong. The fog held through December 22nd, 6 days into the offensive, and German ground forces operated with near total immunity from Allied air attack. American pilots at bases across France and England sat idle, weathered in, watching low clouds obscure targets they couldn't reach. The 8th Air Force flew fewer than 200 sorties during the first 6 days of the Bulge, an operational tempo so reduced that German commanders began to believe their meteorologists' optimistic forecasts might actually hold. Then, on the morning of December 23rd, at 09:14 hours, the fog lifted. A high-pressure system that Crick's models had been tracking for a week finally pushed the cloud cover east, and the sky over Belgium cleared to severe clear visibility, unlimited ceiling, less than 10% cloud cover. More than 5,000 Allied aircraft sortied over the next 48 hours. The scale of the aerial assault was unprecedented, even by the standards of the strategic bombing campaign. On December 24th alone, Allied aircraft dropped 5,784 tons of ordnance on German supply columns, marshalling yards, and troop concentrations, more tonnage than the entire Luftwaffe dropped on Britain during any single month of the Blitz. Fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force operated in close support of ground forces, hitting targets within 1 kilometer of friendly positions, using dive bombing techniques that required visual identification of targets. Medium bombers from the 8th Air Force attacked road junctions and river crossings deeper behind German lines, interdicting supply routes and isolating forward units. Heavy bombers struck rail yards and fuel depots in Germany proper, degrading the Wehrmacht's ability to reinforce or resupply the offensive. A German soldier's diary, catalogued in the Bundesarchiv as MSG2/4892, contains an entry for December 24th that describes the air attacks with visceral precision. Aircraft like a plague of steel locusts. We cannot move without being seen. The road north is a graveyard of vehicles. Men are hiding in the forest, refusing orders to advance. This is not war. This is extermination from above. The diarist was a corporal in the 2nd Panzer Division, part of the Spearhead that had pushed closest to the Meuse River before the weather broke. His unit attempted to retreat on December 26th and was caught in the open by P-47 Thunderbolts, carrying 500-pound bombs and high-velocity aerial rockets. The corporal survived. His unit's vehicle park did not. The P-47's ability to operate in freezing temperatures gave the Allies a technical advantage that German fighters couldn't match. The aircraft's turbocharged Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine included an anti-icing system for the supercharger that allowed operations at temperatures well below -15 degrees Celsius. German fighters, particularly the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109 variants, deployed to the Western Front in late 1944, lacked comparable cold weather systems and experienced significantly higher mechanical failure rates when operating in December conditions. Luftwaffe sortie counts for December 23rd through 25th totaled fewer than 800 flights across the entire Western Front, compared to more than 5,000 Allied sorties. The numerical disparity wasn't just about production capacity. It was about engineering for environmental conditions. To me, the most telling detail isn't Crick's 40% confidence forecast, or the German meteorologist's 90% confidence. It's the fact that both forecasts were based on fundamentally different epistemological approaches to the same physical phenomena. Crick used mathematics to model uncertainty and produce probabilistic predictions. The Germans used observation to identify patterns and produce deterministic predictions. Crick was right, but his rightness came from accepting uncertainty as inherent to the forecasting process. The Germans were wrong, but their wrongness came from overconfidence in historical precedent. Modern weather forecasting has vindicated Crick's approach. Numerical modeling now produces 10-day forecasts with accuracy exceeding 90%. But in 1944, the choice between mathematical and observational methods was genuinely contested. The Germans bet on folklore, the Allies bet on mathematics. The weather broke on December 23rd, and with it, the German offensive's last realistic chance of operational success. The quiet revelation here is that the weather break wasn't luck, it was probability. German meteorologists had calculated odds and gotten them wrong. Crick had calculated odds and gotten them approximately right, within his stated confidence interval. The difference between a 40% chance and a 90% chance is 50 percentage points, which sounds abstract until you realize that 50 percentage points translated into 5,000 aircraft sorties, and the destruction of German logistics capacity across the entire Ardennes front. Weather, that most democratic of combat variables, proved impossible to overcome through tactical brilliance or operational audacity. When the sky cleared, the battle was effectively over, even though the dying continued for another 3 weeks. Chapter 6. The Nurse's Count. Lieutenant Mabel Johnson's pocket notebook, donated to the Smithsonian in 1989, measures roughly 10 centimeters by 15 centimeters, bound in olive drab canvas that's faded to gray-brown. The pages are lined paper, water-stained and brittle, filled with penciled tables that track patients through the triage process at the 47th Field Hospital near Bastogne. Each table follows the same format: received/died/evacuated/returned to duty. The column for return to duty during December 20th through 25th is blank except for 3 question marks. Johnson, an Army Nurse Corps lieutenant who'd shipped to Europe in September 1944, kept this personal tally separate from official medical records because she wanted to understand something the paperwork didn't capture: whether the men she treated ever made it back to their units or simply disappeared into the medical evacuation system, never to be accounted for again. The 47th Field Hospital was established in a converted schoolhouse on the western outskirts of Bastogne on December 18th, as German forces completed the encirclement of the town. The hospital's normal capacity was 150 beds, expandable to 200 in emergency conditions, but on December 19th, Johnson's unit received 340 wounded in 6 hours. The wounded arrived on trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and occasionally on foot if they could walk. Many had been wounded hours or even days earlier and had received only minimal first aid at battalion aid stations before being evacuated rearward. Infections were common. Frostbite was universal. Morphine supplies ran out by midnight on December 19th, and subsequent casualties received emergency treatment without adequate pain management. Official medical records from the Bulge claim an 89% survival rate for wounded who reached aid stations, a statistic that sounds reassuring until you examine the data collection methodology. The survival rate measures patients who survived initial triage and treatment. It doesn't measure the wounded who died before reaching aid stations, and it doesn't track long-term outcomes for casualties evacuated to rear area hospitals. Johnson's notebook, by contrast, tracks specific individuals from intake through disposition, and her survival rate for December 19th through 22nd is 67%. That's a 22 percentage point discrepancy, statistically significant and methodologically illuminating. Johnson was counting differently than the official records. She was counting whether people lived, not whether the hospital's procedures worked as designed. The source conflict here reveals something important about how institutions document their own performance. Official records emphasize systemic success, the percentage of treated patients who survive treatment, while individual practitioners like Johnson track human outcomes, the percentage of wounded soldiers who survive, period. Both measurements are valid, but they answer different questions. The Army Medical Department wanted to know if their field hospitals were functioning effectively. Johnson wanted to know if the men she treated were going to live or die. The difference between those two questions is the difference between logistics and care, and Johnson's notebook suggests she prioritized care, even when it meant documenting outcomes that contradicted official optimism. On December 22nd, a German medical officer captured near Neuville was brought to the 47th Field Hospital for treatment of shrapnel wounds to his left shoulder and arm. The wounds weren't life-threatening, and after treatment, he was placed under guard in a corner of the hospital pending transfer to a POW cage. Johnson's diary, a separate document from her patient notebook, also donated to the Smithsonian, records a conversation she had with the German officer through an interpreter. The officer asked about American medical supply lines, specifically whether the hospital had adequate stocks of plasma and antibiotics. When Johnson confirmed they did, the officer became visibly emotional. According to Johnson's account, he said his unit had one surgeon for 1,400 men, no plasma, and no penicillin. Men with abdominal wounds were dying of infection because German medical units lacked the antibiotics to prevent sepsis. The officer asked how American forces could fly supplies into an encircled position. Johnson told him about the C-47 transports that had begun resupply flights on December 23rd. The officer's response, recorded in Johnson's diary, "You can fly supplies in?" The logistical disparity in medical evacuation and treatment between Allied and German forces in the Bulge was so extreme it's difficult to overstate. The U.S. evacuated 23,000 wounded from the Ardennes by air in 14 days, using C-47 transport aircraft configured with litter racks that could carry 18 wounded per flight. Evacuation flights originated from improvised airstrips as close as 5 kilometers behind front lines and delivered casualties to base hospitals in France within hours of wounding. The entire system, from battalion aid station to definitive surgical care, typically required 6 to 8 hours, sometimes less. German medical evacuation, by contrast, relied on ground ambulances moving over roads that were under constant Allied air attack after December 23rd. German forces evacuated fewer than 4,000 wounded from the Bulge during the entire battle, a 5.75 to 1 disparity that reflects infrastructure, not casualties. When I was examining the comparative casualty data, I found it striking that German surrender rates increased significantly after December 23rd, and prisoner interrogation reports suggest medical care was a motivating factor. German soldiers understood that capture by American forces meant treatment with antibiotics, plasma transfusions, and surgical care that their own medical system couldn't provide. This is particularly evident in cases of frostbite, which affected both sides but was treated very differently. American medical protocols for frostbite included rapid rewarming, anticoagulant therapy, and surgical debridement when necessary. German protocols, constrained by supply shortages, often consisted of amputation, removing gangrenous tissue to prevent systemic infection. Johnson treated a German prisoner on December 27th, whose frostbite was so severe his toes came off like wax when she removed his boots. That detail appears in a medical case study filed by the Army Medical Department in February 1945. Clinical language describing catastrophic tissue damage that could have been prevented with earlier treatment. The technical innovation that made Allied medical superiority possible was freeze-dried plasma, a technology developed in 1940 by Dr. Charles Drew at Columbia University. Plasma stored in liquid form froze solid in December temperatures and was useless for transfusion. Freeze-dried plasma could be reconstituted with sterile water in field conditions and remained stable at temperatures down to -30 degrees Celsius. German medical units still used liquid plasma in glass bottles, which shattered when frozen or required careful storage in heated facilities. The Americans could carry plasma in their aid bags. The Germans couldn't. That single technological difference, freeze-drying, translated into thousands of lives saved because American medics could perform transfusions at point of injury rather than waiting for evacuation to rear area facilities. To me, the most haunting aspect of Johnson's notebook isn't the mortality data or the survival percentages. It's the question marks in the return to duty column. Those question marks represent men whose ultimate fate Johnson never learned. Soldiers who were evacuated further rearward and simply disappeared from her personal accounting. Some returned to their units after recovery, many didn't. Some died in hospitals in England or France, weeks or months after Johnson treated them. Some were discharged as permanently disabled and sent home without Johnson ever knowing whether the limb she'd saved remained functional or whether the infection she'd fought had ultimately won. The question marks are an admission of epistemic limitation. Johnson knew she'd done her best with available resources, but she couldn't know if her best had been good enough. Medical care in combat is provisional, contingent on factors beyond the practitioner's control, and Johnson's notebook documents that contingency with unflinching honesty. She counted, she cared, and she acknowledged what she couldn't know. That combination of precision and humility is what defines effective military medicine, and it's why Johnson's personal records provide historical insight that official statistics obscure. Chapter 7. The Bastogne Math. Captain Harry Keese sat at a wooden table in a basement beneath the Heinz barracks in Bastogne on the night of December 19, 1944, working through arithmetic that would determine whether 11,000 men lived or died. As supply officer for the 101st Airborne Division, Keese had spent the evening conducting an inventory that official records would later describe as comprehensive under adverse conditions, bureaucratic language for counting crates by flashlight while German artillery impacted overhead. His ledger, preserved in the 101st Airborne Division records at the National Archives, shows a 2-column table dated December 19th at 2300 hours. The left column is labeled have. The right column is labeled need. At the bottom of the need column, Keese had written a single word in capital letters: everything. The encirclement of Bastogne was completed sometime between 1900 and 2100 hours on December 19th, though exact timing remains disputed because radio communications with 8th Corps headquarters were severed before formal encirclement was confirmed. What wasn't disputed was the supply situation. The 101st Airborne had deployed to Bastogne with minimal equipment because the deployment order emphasized speed over preparation. Many paratroopers arrived wearing summer uniforms under their jump jackets, carrying basic loads of ammunition but lacking winter gear, heavy weapons, or adequate medical supplies. The division's organic artillery, 3 battalions of 75mm pack howitzers, had deployed with the unit, but ammunition reserves were calculated for 3 days of normal combat operations, not sustained defensive siege. Keith's inventory on December 19th showed 3 days of rations at full consumption rates, 7 days of small arms ammunition at normal expenditure, and 90 minutes of artillery ammunition at standard fire missions. 90 minutes. The number appears in his ledger with a double underline, and next to it, Keith had scrawled a calculation. 10 rounds per gun per day equals 6 days. Rationing mandatory. 10 rounds per gun per day represented an 83% reduction in artillery support compared to doctrinal standards, which called for 60 rounds per gun per day for defensive operations. But 10 rounds per day would extend ammunition supplies from 90 minutes to 6 days, and 6 days might be enough for relief forces to break through from the south. Might be. At 0900 hours on December 20th, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting division commander, issued General Order No. 12. Rations reduced by 50% effective immediately. Artillery fire restricted to confirmed targets only. No reconnaissance by fire, no interdiction missions, no harassing fire. Every shell had to count. The order was distributed to battalion commanders via runner because radio batteries were failing and needed to be conserved for emergency communications. Keith accompanied the order with a supplementary logistics bulletin that detailed what 50% rations actually meant. 1 K ration per man per day instead of 2. Supplemented by captured German supplies when available. Water was not rationed because Bastogne's municipal system remained functional, a piece of infrastructure luck that probably saved more lives than any tactical decision made during the siege. When I was examining the supply records, I found it striking that Keith's calculations proved accurate within remarkable margins. His projection that the division could survive 6 days on existing supplies assumed casualty rates wouldn't exceed 4% per day. Approximately 440 men killed, wounded, or incapacitated daily. The actual casualty rate for December 20th through 25th averaged 3.7% per day, low enough that medical supplies lasted, and high enough that ration consumption decreased as the effective fighting strength declined. This is grim arithmetic, the kind that military staff officers perform in private and never discuss publicly. Keith was calculating how many men could die per day before Bastogne became mathematically unsustainable, and his calculations proved horrifyingly accurate. The first aerial resupply mission arrived over Bastogne on December 23rd at 1400 hours, 4 full days into the encirclement, and precisely when Keith's projections indicated supplies would reach critical levels. The mission consisted of 16 C-47 transport aircraft from the 9th Troop Carrier Command, each aircraft carrying 9 parachute bundles containing ammunition, medical supplies, and rations. Keith had calculated drop zones based on German positions and artillery observation points, determining that the acceptable loss rate for parachutes was 35%, meaning if 65% of bundles were recovered, the resupply would meet minimum requirements. The actual recovery rate on December 23rd was 73%. 144 tons of supplies were dropped. 105 tons were recovered. Keith's after-action report notes, resupply adequate for 1.2 days at normal consumption. Current reduced consumption extends this to 4 days. Mission success. The technical challenge of conducting aerial resupply drops into a besieged perimeter under anti-aircraft fire cannot be overstated. C-47 pilots had to approach at 300 feet altitude to ensure parachutes deployed properly. Any higher, and bundles drifted outside the perimeter into German positions. Any lower, and parachutes didn't have time to fully deploy. 300 feet put the aircraft well within range of German 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns, and pilots had no room for evasive maneuvering during the drop run. The solution was timing. Pilots calculated release points using stopwatch timing from visual checkpoints, essentially dead-reckoning navigation at near stall speeds under fire. 2 C-47s were shot down during resupply missions between December 23rd and 26th. Both crews were killed. The missions continued. On December 22nd, the day before aerial resupply began, German forces delivered a surrender demand to McAuliffe via written message under flag of truce. The message was formal, noting that Bastogne was surrounded, that resistance was futile, and that honorable surrender would be granted with full prisoner of war protections under the Geneva Conventions. McAuliffe's response, "Nuts," has become legendary, but what's less known is that the response was based on Keyes' supply forecast. McAuliffe consulted Keyes before drafting his reply, asking directly whether the division could hold for 4 more days. Keyes showed him the calculations. Existing supplies extended to December 26th at current consumption rates. Aerial resupply was expected within 48 hours, and if relief forces were moving as rumored, breakthrough could occur by December 26th or 27th. The answer was yes, Bastogne could hold. McAuliffe's "nuts" wasn't bravado. It was a calculated response based on logistics projections, showing the siege was survivable. Patton's 4th Armored Division made contact with Bastogne's defenders on December 26th at 16:45 hours, 6 days and 21 hours after encirclement was completed. Keyes' final supply count, conducted that evening after the corridor was opened, showed 11 hours of artillery ammunition remaining at reduced expenditure rates. 11 hours. His 6-day projection had been accurate within 4 hours. A 2.8% margin of error in an operational environment where 10% error margins are considered excellent. To me, the most telling detail isn't Keyes' accuracy, but his methodology. He didn't predict supplies would last about a week or several days. He calculated precisely 6 days, using consumption rates, casualty projections, and resupply probabilities. That precision was possible only because he'd maintained detailed inventory records throughout the deployment, updating his ledgers daily, even as the tactical situation deteriorated. The broader historical lesson from Bastogne isn't about heroism or determination, though both were present in abundance. It's about the relationship between arithmetic and survival in modern warfare. McAuliffe's decision to refuse surrender was rational only because Keyes' mathematics showed that survival was possible. Without those calculations, refusing surrender would have been a death sentence for 11,000 men, who'd have starved or run out of ammunition within days. The Bastogne math, Keyes' unglamorous, methodical supply accounting, was what made the heroic narrative possible. Wars aren't won by brave speeches. They're won by supply officers who can calculate consumption rates accurately enough to tell their commanders whether bravery is strategically viable or tactically suicidal. Keyes gave McAuliffe the numbers. McAuliffe said, "Nuts." The arithmetic held, barely, and Bastogne became a symbol of American resilience rather than an example of American hubris. The difference between those two outcomes was 11 hours of artillery ammunition and one captain's ability to count under pressure. Chapter 8. The Panzer's Transmission. The maintenance log for Panther tank number 223 survives at the Bovington Tank Museum in Dorset, England, a slim notebook bound in black oilcloth, with pages that smell faintly of diesel fuel and metal shavings, even 80 years later. The log belonged to Hauptmann Ernst Barkmann, a panzer commander in the 2nd Panzer Division, and it documents 3 separate final drive failures during the Ardennes offensive. The entry for December 18, 1944, reads, "Final drive replaced, again. Recommend Court-Martial of Procurement Office." That final sentence wasn't military humor. It was genuine frustration from an experienced tanker who understood that his tank's transmission was more dangerous to German offensive operations than any American anti-tank gun. The Panther tank's final drive bearing was a known design flaw by late 1944, documented in field reports dating back to the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. The bearing housing was designed for a 35-ton vehicle, but successive up-armoring modifications had increased the Panther's combat weight to 44.8 tons, without corresponding upgrades to the transmission or final drive components. The result was catastrophic. The final drive bearing was subjected to loads nearly 30% above its rated capacity, causing premature wear and failure. German engineers understood the problem. Technical bulletins from the Waffenamt recommended final drive replacement every 250 kilometers. But solving it would have required redesigning the entire transmission housing, retooling production lines, and halting Panther production for months. The Wehrmacht needed tanks immediately. They needed improved tanks eventually. Eventually never came. Bachmann's Panther threw a track 6 kilometers from the start line on December 17th at 0430 hours, 90 minutes into the offensive. The tank platoon log, captured at Celles in late December and now archived at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, records that track repair required 90 minutes with assistance from the entire crew, and a second Panther providing anchor points for the track tensioning equipment. 90 minutes is an eternity in mechanized warfare. While Bachmann's crew wrestled with 40-ton track sections in freezing darkness, the spearhead of the German advance moved forward without them, opening gaps in the column that subsequent vehicles couldn't close without bunching up and creating traffic congestion. One broken track, 6 kilometers from the border, degraded the offensive's momentum before any enemy contact occurred. The final drive bearing failed again on December 19th, after the Panther had traveled approximately 140 kilometers, well below the rated 250-kilometer service life. Captured German technical manuals attribute bearing failures to inadequate lubrication, but Allied technical intelligence reports from January 1945 identify the actual cause: metallurgical defects in the bearing steel caused by nickel shortages in German war production. Nickel was essential for high-strength steel alloys, and Allied strategic bombing of chromite supply lines from Turkey had restricted Germany's nickel imports by 63% compared to 1942 levels. The result was bearing steel that met peacetime specifications, but failed under sustained combat loads. This wasn't sabotage by slave laborers, as some German officers claimed. It was material science failure caused by industrial infrastructure collapse. When I was examining the U.S. Army Ordnance Survey, conducted in January 1945, I found it striking that 68% of abandoned Panthers in the Bulge sector showed final drive failure as the primary mechanical fault. Not battle damage, not fuel exhaustion, but transmission failure. The survey examined 96 Panthers, abandoned in positions from Celles to Stavelot, and 65 showed diagnostic evidence of final drive bearing seizure, metal scoring on the drive shaft, metal fragments in the transmission oil, or complete bearing disintegration. These weren't tanks that had been knocked out by enemy fire and subsequently abandoned. They were tanks that had broken down mechanically and couldn't be repaired or recovered before Allied forces overran their positions. Bachmann's tank experienced its third and final breakdown on December 24th near Celles, approximately 8 kilometers from the Meuse River, the closest any element of 2nd Panzer Division came to its objective. The final drive seized completely, locking the right track and immobilizing the vehicle. Bachmann's crew attempted to tow the tank using another Panther, standard recovery procedure for disabled vehicles, but the tow cable snapped under load. The cable, rated for 30 tons, couldn't handle the weight of a 44.8-ton Panther on icy road conditions, where friction was minimal. The crew tried again with doubled cables. The second attempt succeeded in moving the disabled tank approximately 50 meters before the final drive on the towing Panther began showing signs of stress, excessive heat, and grinding noises that indicated bearing failure was imminent. Bachmann ordered both tanks abandoned. The technical specifications of the Panther's final drive reveal a cascade of engineering compromises that individually seemed reasonable but collectively proved catastrophic. The drive ratio was 7.25 to 1, meaning the engine turned 7.25 revolutions for every single revolution of the road wheels. At highway speeds of approximately 38 kilometers per hour, the final drive was rotating at roughly 420 revolutions per minute, generating significant frictional heat even with adequate lubrication. In December, temperatures averaging -8 degrees Celsius, the transmission oil thickened, increasing viscosity and reducing lubrication efficiency by an estimated 30 to 40%. Cold oil meant more friction meant more heat meant accelerated bearing wear. The Panthers were literally destroying themselves through normal operation. German doctrine for the Ardennes offensive required tanks to advance 50 to 60 kilometers per day to maintain the operational tempo necessary for reaching the Meuse before Allied reserves could respond. The Panther could barely sustain 30 kilometers per day before mechanical failure became statistically probable. Bachmann's maintenance log shows his tank averaged 27 kilometers per day of mobile operations, with the remainder of time spent immobilized for repairs or waiting for fuel resupply. That's roughly half the required advance rate. And Bachmann was an experienced tank commander with a skilled crew and access to maintenance support. Less experienced crews and units with degraded maintenance capabilities performed worse. To me, the most telling detail isn't the engineering failure itself, but the bureaucratic response documented in captured German military correspondence. Bachmann's recommendation for court-martial of procurement office wasn't unique. Similar complaints appear in after-action reports from multiple panzer units throughout 1944. The procurement office responsible for Panther production had received these complaints and conducted investigations, and their conclusion, documented in Waffenamt files captured at Flensburg in May 1945, was that bearing failures were within acceptable parameters for combat operations. Acceptable parameters. The German military-industrial complex had normalized catastrophic mechanical failure rates because admitting the problem required admitting that Germany couldn't produce the materials necessary to build reliable tanks. Ideology couldn't solve metallurgy problems, and neither could tactical brilliance compensate for transmissions that failed after 140 kilometers. The Panther's reputation as a superior weapon system is historically accurate regarding firepower and armor protection. The 75mm KWK-42 gun was among the most effective tank guns of the war, and the frontal armor was nearly impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons. But reputation and reality diverge regarding mobility and reliability. The Panther was mechanically unreliable, to a degree that rendered it strategically ineffective for offensive operations requiring sustained movement over long distances. Germany lost the Battle of the Bulge, in part because their best tank couldn't reliably drive 150 kilometers without breaking down, and no amount of tactical virtuosity could overcome that fundamental limitation. Bachmann survived the war, was captured by American forces in early 1945, and in post-war interviews consistently blamed German industrial policy, rather than Allied combat effectiveness, for the failure of the Ardennes offensive. He was right. His tank's maintenance log proves it. One failed bearing at a time. Chapter 9. The Belgian Forest. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Ingersoll stood at a road junction 8 kilometers southeast of Bastogne in mid-January 1945, surveying terrain that had cost thousands of lives and effectively determined the outcome of the Ardennes offensive before the first shot was fired. Ingersoll, an Army Corps of Engineers officer assigned to conduct post-battle terrain analysis, had spent 3 days walking the roads and trails the German army had used during their advance, and his preliminary conclusion was both obvious and devastating. The Ardennes was possibly the worst terrain in Western Europe for mechanized offensive operations. His survey map, preserved in engineer command records at the National Archives, shows road density calculations that read like an indictment: 0.7 paved roads per square kilometer versus 4.2 in the adjacent Rhine plain. Someone, probably Ingersoll himself, had drawn a red circle around the Ardennes region with a handwritten annotation. Why here? The question wasn't rhetorical. German staff studies for Operation Wacht am Rhein, captured in 1945 and now archived in the Bundesarchiv, explicitly acknowledged the terrain limitations. The Ardennes forest was classified as restricted terrain in German tactical manuals, defined as terrain unsuitable for armor operations without significant engineering support. The region's topography consisted of steep-sided valleys, separated by wooded ridges, with limited road networks connecting small villages that had changed little since medieval times. Roads were narrow, averaging 6 to 7 meters wide, with sharp curves, steep grades, and minimal shoulder space for vehicle passing. Bridge weight limits throughout the region averaged Class 35, meaning they could theoretically support vehicles up to 35 tons. The King Tiger weighed 69 tons. German planners identified 14 roll bonds, main roads designated for the offensive's primary axes of advance. Ingersoll's survey examined all 14 and concluded only 4 could support sustained tank traffic without immediate engineering intervention. The remainder required bridge reinforcement, road widening, or bypass construction before armor could transit safely. This wasn't a surprise to German engineers. Their pre-offensive planning documents included detailed schedules for bridge reinforcement and road improvement, work that was supposed to be completed within hours of the initial breakthrough, using engineer battalions attached to the assault divisions. It wasn't. Engineer units encountered delays, resistance, and higher than expected casualty rates, and by December 18th, most roll bonds were operating well below planned capacity. The practical result of terrain constraints was traffic congestion that German logistics officers hadn't adequately modeled. A vivid example appears in the after-action report from 2nd Panzer Division, which describes a 7-hour delay on December 17th when a destroyed American half-track blocked the road at a narrow section near Schönberg. The half-track weighed approximately 9 tons and had been knocked out by German fire during the initial advance, then pushed partially off the road to allow follow-on traffic to pass. But partially wasn't sufficient. Vehicles could squeeze past single file, reducing traffic flow to approximately 1 vehicle every 3 minutes versus the 15 vehicles per minute required to maintain operational tempo. The traffic jam extended 11 kilometers behind the bottleneck, immobilizing an entire regiment for most of the day. When I was cross-referencing German operational plans with actual advance rates, I found it striking that the discrepancy between planned and actual progress was greatest on the narrowest roads. The 5th Panzer Army, advancing through slightly more open terrain in the southern sector, achieved approximately 73% of its planned advance rate during the first 3 days. 6th Panzer Army, attacking through the most restricted terrain in the northern sector, achieved 41%. The difference wasn't combat effectiveness or unit quality, it was road capacity. Geography determined operational outcomes more decisively than tactics, training, or equipment. American engineers exploited these terrain constraints with systematic efficiency. On December 20th, U.S. combat engineers blew a bridge at Trois Ponts that carried one of the few roads capable of supporting heavy armor. The bridge destruction forced German forces to detour 28 kilometers to the nearest crossing point, adding approximately 14 hours to their movement timeline. 14 hours was sufficient time for American forces to establish defensive positions at the next logical road junction, forcing the Germans to deploy from march column into attack formation, engage in time-consuming combat, and fall further behind schedule. This is terrain leverage, using geography to multiply defensive effectiveness and impose time penalties that accumulate across multiple engagements. The Ardennes has approximately 2,100 kilometers of roads, ranging from paved highways to dirt logging tracks. German planners needed to move 1,400 tanks and 200,000 men through this network in 48 hours to achieve their operational timeline. Ingersoll's survey calculated the traffic density, 0.67 vehicles per meter of road, meaning bumper-to-bumper traffic across the entire road network, with zero margin for breakdown, obstacle, or enemy interdiction. This was planning fiction, masquerading as operational reality. No road network could sustain that traffic density under combat conditions, especially with engineers actively destroying bridges and cratering roads behind retreating American forces. Aerial reconnaissance from the 8th Air Force Photo Reconnaissance Wing, conducted on December 26 after weather cleared, documented 347 German vehicles abandoned on roads throughout the Ardennes. The aerial survey report noted that most vehicles weren't battle damaged. They were simply immobile, blocked by traffic congestion, or disabled vehicles ahead of them in column. When Allied ground forces overran these positions in early January, they discovered many of the vehicles had fuel and ammunition remaining. They hadn't been knocked out by American fire. They'd been abandoned because the crews couldn't move forward or backward and face capture if they remained. The engineering specifications of a Class 40 military bridge provide technical context for Germany's bridging challenges. A Class 40 bridge, rated for 40-ton vehicles, required a clear span of approximately 15 to 20 meters, depending on the river width and current velocity, supported by either prefabricated steel sections or timber cribbing if materials permitted on-site construction. Construction time for a full engineer battalion operating without enemy interference averaged 19 hours from site survey to traffic-capable bridge. German engineer battalions in the Ardennes were working under artillery fire, with limited materials due to supply line congestion, and against timelines that allowed 6 to 8 hours maximum before the offensive's momentum would be irretrievably lost. They couldn't meet those timelines. To me, the most telling detail isn't any single bridge or road junction, but Ingersoll's overall conclusion, submitted to First Army in February 1945. The terrain selected by German planners was defensible by a minimal force and nearly impassable to a large one. American defensive success was determined as much by geography as by tactical competence. That's a remarkably candid assessment, essentially arguing that the U.S. forces didn't so much win the Battle of the Bulge as avoid losing it, while geography defeated the German offensive. Ingersoll was right, and his assessment raises uncomfortable questions about whether American commanders understood how fortunate they'd been. The Germans chose the Ardennes because it was lightly defended and offered surprise. They lost because surprise couldn't overcome road networks that simply couldn't support the traffic volume required for operational success. Geography, that most implacable of military factors, proved impossible to overcome through audacity, training, or tactical skill. The forests and valleys of the Ardennes were more effective than any American defensive plan, and they asked nothing in return except patience, the one quality attackers on a deadline can never afford. Chapter 10. The Radio Silence. Oberst Friedrich August von der Heydt's mission log for December 17, 1944, contains a single repeated entry that appears 14 times across 6 hours. No contact, no contact, no contact. Von der Heydt commanded approximately 1,200 Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, who dropped behind American lines near Barak Michel in the early morning hours of December 17th, their mission to seize and hold a critical road junction that would facilitate the advance of 6th Panzer Army. The operation required precise coordination with ground forces advancing from the east, and von der Heydt carried 3 separate radio sets to ensure redundant communication with higher headquarters. All 3 radios were damaged during the parachute drop. Of 1,200 men, 35 carried portable radios. None remained functional after landing. The torn .fu.D2 portable radio was the standard German infantry communication system in late 1944, a 10-kilogram unit with an advertised range of 750 meters on flat terrain under ideal conditions. The Ardennes in December provided neither flat terrain nor ideal conditions. Dense forest canopy, steep valleys, and winter storm atmospheric conditions reduced the effective range to approximately 200 meters, making company-to-company communication barely possible, and battalion-to-regiment communication essentially impossible without relay stations. Von der Heyt's paratroopers were supposed to establish such relay stations after landing, but the drop scatter was severe. Men landed across a 6-kilometer radius instead of the planned 1-kilometer concentration, and many relay teams couldn't locate each other in darkness and forest. By 0900 hours on December 17th, von der Heydt had assembled approximately 350 men from his original 1,200, roughly 29% of his force. The remainder were scattered across the Ardennes, attempting to reach the rally point, or captured by American forces who stumbled across isolated paratroopers in the woods. Von der Heydt's immediate problem wasn't tactical. He'd seized his objective. The road junction was secure, but communicative. He had no way to inform 6th Panzer Army that the junction was held, no way to coordinate link-up timing, and no way to request resupply or reinforcement. Radio silence imposed by equipment failure was indistinguishable from radio silence imposed by enemy jamming or command decision, and von der Heydt had no way to communicate the distinction. On December 18th, von der Heydt sent a runner to contact the nearest German unit, estimated to be approximately 9 kilometers to the east based on the sound of artillery fire. The runner, a sergeant whose name appears in the mission log as Schmidt, walked for 11 hours before being captured by American soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division. Schmidt's interrogation report, filed on December 19th and preserved in 1st Army intelligence summaries, notes that he was carrying a handwritten message from von der Heydt, requesting immediate relief and stating that the paratroop force could hold for maximum 72 hours without resupply. The message never reached German lines. Schmidt spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in England, unaware that his capture had sealed the fate of von der Heyt's isolated force. When I was examining German operational communications for the Bulge, I found it striking that von der Heydt's mission exemplified a systemic Wehrmacht communications failure that extended far beyond his isolated paratroop drop. German offensive doctrine required 47 separate divisional headquarters to coordinate attacks across an 85-mile front, and coordination required reliable communication. Allied radio intercepts, however, show that fewer than 12 German divisions maintained consistent communication with corps-level command after December 18th. The remainder either observed strict radio silence to avoid Allied interception, thereby rendering themselves invisible to their own command structure, or attempted to communicate and failed due to equipment limitations or atmospheric interference. The German radio security protocols of late 1944 were stringent to the point of operational paralysis. Following repeated instances where Allied intelligence exploited German radio traffic for tactical advantage, Wehrmacht communications doctrine mandated minimal radio use, coded brevity codes, and frequent frequency changes. These protocols were sound from a security perspective, but catastrophic from a coordination perspective. Von der Heydt's situation illustrates the paradox. He couldn't use radio effectively because the equipment didn't work in forested terrain. But even if it had worked, doctrine prohibited transmissions that might reveal German positions to Allied direction-finding equipment. Security and operational necessity were fundamentally incompatible, and German commanders consistently prioritized security over coordination. On December 19th, von der Heydt intercepted an American radio transmission and realized, with what his post-capture interrogation describes as terrible clarity, that American forces had triangulated his position through his earlier transmission attempts. U.S. signal intelligence reports from First Army confirm this. Direction-finding stations at 3 locations had identified radio signals matching German frequency patterns originating from the Barak-Michel area, and artillery fire missions had been planned based on those fixes. Von der Heydt immediately ordered complete radio silence, but the damage was done. American forces knew approximately where the German paratroopers were located and adjusted defensive dispositions accordingly. The effective range of the torn.fu.d2 in the conditions von der Heydt faced, dense forest, hilly terrain, winter atmospheric conditions, was less than 200 meters, making it barely adequate for platoon-level communication and completely inadequate for anything approaching operational coordination. This wasn't a secret. German after-action reports from the Eastern Front had documented the radio's limitations in forested terrain as early as 1942. But industrial capacity constraints meant the Wehrmacht couldn't replace the torn.fu.d2 with more powerful systems, and operational requirements meant commanders continued to plan missions that assumed radio communications would function reliably. The gap between doctrinal assumption and technical reality created repeated failures like von der Heydt's. On December 21st, after 4 days without contact with German forces, and with his men suffering from exposure, ammunition exhaustion, and declining morale, von der Heydt surrendered to American forces near Monschau. His interrogation report notes severe frostbite on his feet. He'd been walking through snow in leather jump boots designed for summer operations, and profound exhaustion. When asked why he'd surrendered rather than attempting to break through to German lines, von der Heydt responded that he had no idea where German lines were, no means of communicating with them, and no realistic expectation of survival if he continued. The interrogator noted that von der Heydt seemed more frustrated than defeated, angry at what he characterized as inadequate planning and impossible mission parameters. To me, the most haunting aspect of von der Heydt's mission log isn't the repeated no-contact entries, but what they represent. A competent officer executing a mission that was impossible from inception due to equipment inadequacies no one had bothered to address. The U.S. military's JTRS program, Joint Tactical Radio System, spent $15 billion between 2003 and 2011 attempting to develop a secure, long-range, portable radio system that could operate reliably in contested terrain. The program was ultimately canceled as technologically unfeasible with 2011 technology. Germany, in 1944, was attempting to coordinate multi-division offensives using radios that couldn't transmit 200 meters through forest. Von der Heydt's repeated log entries weren't just documentation of communication failure. They were documentation of institutional delusion, the Wehrmacht's persistent belief that willpower and training could compensate for technological inadequacy. It couldn't. Von der Heide's 1,200 paratroopers, among the most elite soldiers Germany still possessed in late 1944, were rendered operationally irrelevant, not by American combat action, but by radios that didn't work, and a mission plan that assumed they would. Chapter 11. Patton's Pivot. Colonel Walter J. Mueller sat in the operations room of 3rd Army Headquarters in Nancy, France, on the afternoon of December 19, 1944, staring at a movement order that he knew was impossible. Eisenhower had directed Patton to disengage 3 divisions from the Saar offensive, pivot them 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German Bulge penetration, and he wanted this done within 48 hours. Mueller, 3rd Army's G4 logistics officer, had just finished calculating what that would actually require, moving 80,000 men, 40,000 vehicles, and roughly 25,000 tons of supplies through a road network already congested with supply traffic and refugee columns. His initial time estimate was 214 hours of continuous road movement to reposition all units. He had 48 hours. On the first page of his movement order, Mueller scrawled a coffee-stained post-it note that read, "This will never work. WJM." The meeting at Verdun on the morning of December 19th has become legendary in American military history, primarily for Patton's declaration that he could attack north within 48 hours, while most of Eisenhower's staff thought 7 days minimum was realistic. What's less known is that Patton had no logistics plan when he made that claim. He was gambling that Mueller could improvise one fast enough to make the boast reality. Patton returned to Nancy immediately after the Verdun meeting and found Mueller already working on movement orders, having anticipated the likely directive based on radio traffic intercepts about the German breakthrough. The conversation between Patton and Mueller is documented in 3rd Army's historical records. Patton asked if 48 hours was possible. Mueller said no. Patton told him to figure it out anyway. Mueller's solution was methodologically brutal. He abandoned sequential movement in favor of pulse convoys. Traditional military movement doctrine called for units to move in order, first artillery, then infantry, then support elements, to ensure units arrived at their destination in proper configuration for immediate combat. Pulse convoys ignored sequence and instead moved whatever was ready, whenever it was ready, in 45-minute intervals with 15-minute gaps between pulses. Faster units could overtake slower units at designated bypass points, road junctions where traffic directors would wave slower vehicles off the main route to let faster traffic pass. It was ugly, it violated doctrine, and it would create organizational chaos when units arrived out of sequence. It was also the only method that could move 80,000 men in 48 hours. The 3rd Army's movement study, filed as an appendix to the G4 after-action report for December 1944, contains calculations that are simultaneously impressive and terrifying. To move 40,000 vehicles using 3 main roads within 48 hours required an average of 833 vehicles per road per hour. 1 vehicle every 4.3 seconds, continuously, for 2 full days. Any delay, mechanical breakdown, traffic accident, fuel stop, would cascade through the entire system and potentially collapse the timeline. Mueller's plan included pre-positioned recovery teams every 5 kilometers along the movement routes, with authority to push disabled vehicles off roads immediately, rather than attempting field repairs. Disabled vehicles were abandoned and marked for later recovery. Operational tempo took priority over equipment preservation. When I was examining the movement logs, I found it striking that the 4th Armored Division, which would lead the attack toward Bastogne, covered 150 kilometers in 19 hours, while maintaining unit cohesion sufficient for immediate combat upon arrival. That's an average speed of 7.9 kilometers per hour, including all stops, maintenance halts, and traffic delays. For context, peacetime military movements typically achieve 3 to 4 kilometers per hour when moving full divisions with all equipment. The 4th Armored sustained nearly double the normal rate under winter conditions on roads, shared with civilian traffic and supply columns. This wasn't superior equipment or training, it was logistical optimization, pushed to the absolute limit of vehicle mechanical reliability. The fuel consumption during 3rd Army's pivot northward was staggering. Patton's 3 divisions consumed 782,000 liters of fuel during the movement to Bastogne, more than the entire German 6th Panzer Army used in the first week of their offensive. The disparity wasn't just industrial capacity, it was distribution infrastructure. U.S. supply columns were delivering fuel through the Red Ball Express system, a dedicated truck convoy route that operated 24 hours per day, delivering supplies from Normandy ports to forward areas. German supply lines, by contrast, were under constant Allied air interdiction after December 23rd, and relied on rail transport that was systematically degraded by strategic bombing. Third Army could consume 782,000 liters because that fuel was reliably available. German forces could plan to capture fuel because their own supply system couldn't deliver it. On December 22nd, at 0600 hours, the 4th Armored Division's lead elements crossed the line of departure and attacked northward toward Bastogne. The division had covered 150 kilometers, reorganized for combat, and launched an offensive within 72 hours of receiving movement orders, 24 hours later than Patton's promised 48-hour timeline, but still 3 days faster than Schäf's staff had considered possible. Muller's movement order worked because he'd correctly predicted that doctrinal sequence didn't matter as much as arrival timing, and that organizational chaos at the destination could be resolved faster than movement delays could be overcome. The contrast with German logistics is almost painful. German armored divisions in the Bulge were immobilized for lack of fuel, while American armored divisions were consuming fuel at rates that would have sustained German offensive operations for weeks. This wasn't just about production capacity. German synthetic fuel plants were producing approximately 130,000 barrels per day in December 1944, insufficient for both mobile operations and strategic reserves. It was about prioritization. Germany chose to allocate fuel to an offensive that had low probability of strategic success, rather than conserving reserves for defensive operations that might have prolonged the war. The Bulge offensive consumed Germany's remaining operational fuel reserves in 3 weeks, and achieved nothing except accelerating the Wehrmacht's collapse. To me, the most telling detail isn't Patton's famous declaration at Verdun, or the dramatic relief of Bastogne. It's Muller's post-it note. This will never work. He was right, in a strictly doctrinal sense. The movement plan violated established procedures, created organizational chaos, and succeeded only because everyone involved worked beyond reasonable limits and accepted risks that peacetime planning would never tolerate. But it worked. Third Army pivoted 90 degrees, moved 80,000 men 150 kilometers, and launched a successful offensive in 72 hours, because Muller understood that impossible missions become possible when you abandon idealized procedures in favor of functional approximations. His movement order is still taught at the Army War College, as an example of adaptive logistics planning under extreme time constraints. Modern military logistics software like JOPS, Joint Operation Planning and Execution System, uses algorithms derived from Muller's pulse convoy methodology. The computers just run the calculations faster than Muller could with paper and pencil. But the underlying logic is identical. Move what's ready when it's ready, accept chaos at the destination, and trust that operational urgency will overcome organizational disorder. It's ugly logistics, the kind that makes staff officers nervous, but it works when nothing else can. Chapter 12. The Volkssturm Boy. The diary sits in the National Archives under Record Group 242, Captured German Documents, a slim notebook bound in brown paper with pages that show water damage and pencil smudges. The handwriting belongs to a 16-year-old identified in translation only as Hans Weber, a pseudonym applied by Army translators in 1945 to protect a minor's identity, even in classified documents. Weber served in the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, one of the Wehrmacht's late-war formations, composed primarily of teenage conscripts and men over 45 deemed too old for regular military service. His diary spans 13 days, from December 14th through December 26th, and it documents the collapse of German unit cohesion in real time, through the observations of someone who understood he was watching defeat unfold, but lacked the military vocabulary to articulate what he was seeing. December 16th, the day the offensive began, contains an entry that's simultaneously naive and perceptive. They told us this was victory. It looks like dying. Weber's company was issued 1 rifle per 3 men during mobilization, with verbal assurances they'd collect more from the dead, a detail confirmed in the 18th Volksgrenadier Division's mobilization order, which notes a 37% shortfall in small arms that would be rectified through battlefield recovery. This wasn't operational flexibility, it was desperation masquerading as planning. Expecting teenage conscripts to arm themselves by scavenging corpses on a battlefield was the Wehrmacht's institutional admission that Germany no longer possessed the industrial capacity to equip its own army. Weber's training, documented in earlier diary entries from November, consisted of 11 days of instruction, 3 days of political indoctrination explaining why Germany must win, 8 days of basic drill and small unit tactics, 0 live-fire exercises, 0 defensive position construction training, 0 first aid training beyond apply pressure to wounds. This is what military sociologists call ritual training, going through the motions of military preparation without the resources or time to actually prepare soldiers for combat. Weber's company entered combat having never fired their weapons, having never seen how artillery impacts terrain, having never experienced the disorientation and chaos that defines infantry combat. They learned by dying. December 18th contains a sketch of a church steeple, drawn with surprising artistic competence. Below the sketch, "They told us this was victory. It looks like dying." Weber was repeating himself, the phrase appearing in multiple entries, and I find that repetition striking, not as literary technique, but as genuine cognitive loop, someone trying to process an experience for which he had no frame of reference. He'd been told the offensive was succeeding, that German forces were advancing victoriously, but what he actually observed was wounded streaming eastward in greater numbers than troops moving west toward the front. The contradiction between official narrative and visible reality was creating psychological dissonance he didn't know how to resolve. December 20th describes a panzer column passing Weber's position in a forest near Saint-Vith. They look like ghosts. No one waves, no one sings. Earlier diary entries from training describe soldiers marching with music and camaraderie, the romanticized image of military service that Wehrmacht recruiting emphasized. The reality Weber encountered was exhausted men in frozen vehicles, conserving energy, no longer performing the social rituals of unit cohesion, because those rituals require energy reserves no one possessed. The contrast between expectation and reality appears throughout the diary, a persistent theme of discovering that war is nothing like what authority figures promised it would be. December 21st records an event that appears in the 18th Volksgrenadier Division's after-action report, under bureaucratic language. Command element of 2nd Battalion, 594th Regiment, temporarily absent from position, night of 20 to 21 December. Weber's description is more direct. The Hauptmann is gone, took his kit. Sergeant says he went to find ammunition. Everyone knows he ran. The company commander had deserted, abandoning his unit under cover of darkness, and the remaining soldiers understood immediately what had happened, despite official explanations. Unit cohesion, the social and psychological bonds that make military organizations function, had collapsed when the commander demonstrated through action that he prioritized personal survival over organizational loyalty. The source conflict between official German reports and soldier testimony like Weber's is historically illuminating. German situation reports from December 20th describe continued offensive operations with satisfactory progress, while Weber's diary describes men refusing to advance, hiding in foxholes, ignoring orders. Both accounts are true within their respective contexts. Situation reports described command-level intentions, while Weber described ground-level reality. The Wehrmacht's command structure was issuing orders that field units were no longer capable of executing, and the gap between command expectations and unit capabilities was widening daily. December 22nd, Weber's unit surrendered near Saint-Vith without firing a shot. The entry reads, "They gave us coffee and cigarettes. I haven't eaten in 3 days. This is defeat." The prisoner log from the 1st Infantry Division confirms that elements of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division surrendered en masse on December 22nd, approximately 340 men from various units, and notes that prisoners showed signs of malnutrition and exposure. Several prisoners required immediate medical attention for frostbite and hypothermia. These weren't soldiers defeated in combat. They were adolescents and middle-aged men who'd been sent to fight without adequate equipment, training, or supplies, and who'd concluded that survival required surrender. When I was analyzing surrender rates across different German formations in the Bulge, I found that Volksgrenadier divisions had a surrender rate of approximately 4 times higher than Waffen-SS divisions. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division specifically showed a 23% surrender rate by December 26th, meaning nearly 1/4 of the division's strength had been captured, rather than killed, wounded, or successfully withdrawn. That's catastrophic for unit cohesion. The disparity with SS units wasn't about courage or cowardice. It was about ideological commitment and perceived alternatives. SS soldiers believed, or had been convinced to act as if they believed, that surrender meant death at the hands of vengeful allies. Volksgrenadier conscripts like Weber had no such ideological framework, and correctly assessed that surrender to American forces offered better survival prospects than continued combat in a losing battle. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division entered the Battle of the Bulge with approximately 16,200 men. By December 26th, only 4,400 were still combat effective, a 73% attrition rate. Casualty reports show only 2,100 killed or wounded, meaning approximately 9,700 men either deserted or surrendered. That's not a military unit. It's an armed mob in the process of disintegration. Weber's diary documents that disintegration from the inside. The missing equipment, the absent commander, the men who stopped following orders because authority had demonstrably failed them. To me, the most unbearable detail isn't Weber's final entry about defeat. It's that sketch of the church steeple. He was 16 years old, conscripted into a war he didn't understand, sent to fight with inadequate weapons and training, and he still tried to find something beautiful worth documenting. The sketch is crude but competent, suggesting someone who'd drawn before, who had interests and skills beyond military service. The Wehrmacht took that person and sent him to the Ardennes in December, with 1 rifle per 3 men and instructions to collect more from the dead. Weber survived, surrendered, and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. His diary was confiscated during processing, translated by Army intelligence analysts looking for tactical information, and eventually archived as a historical document. Whether Weber ever knew his diary survived, whether he ever tried to recover it after the war, remains unknown. The archive contains no follow-up correspondence, no requests for return, just a brown paper notebook with water-stained pages and 1 sketch of a church steeple, proof that someone tried to preserve beauty while surrounded by institutional failure and human waste. Chapter 13. The Bridge That Wasn't. Major General Leonard Giraud's operational map for December 17, 1944, hangs in the 5th Corps Historical Collection at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, a large-scale tactical map marked with grease pencil circles around 3 river crossings at Huy, Ardennes, and Givet. The circles are labeled Priority Defense in Giraud's handwriting, and beside them a note reads, "If they get here, we've lost. They won't get here." Giraud commanded 5th Corps, responsible for defending the northern shoulder of the Bulge penetration, and his map annotation reveals something crucial about how the battle was actually won. Allied commanders correctly predicted German objectives and positioned forces to defend those objectives before German spearheads came anywhere close. The Battle of the Bulge was decided not by the fighting that happened, but by the fighting that never occurred because the Germans couldn't reach the places where it would have mattered. The Meuse River represented the operational objective of the German offensive, not the symbolic endpoint, but the practical one. Crossing the Meuse would split Allied forces north and south, disrupt supply lines running through Liège and Antwerp, and create strategic chaos that might force negotiation, or at minimum, delay Allied offensive operations for months. German operational plans, captured intact at various headquarters in early 1945, specified that lead elements must reach Meuse bridges by December 19th, 3 days after the offensive began. The plan assumed surprise would produce psychological collapse, that American units would flee rather than fight, and that roads would be open for rapid exploitation. None of those assumptions held. Giraud issued Operations Order Number 47 on December 17th at 1100 hours. 31 hours into the German offensive. The order repositioned the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, to establish blocking positions 30 kilometers west of the current German advance. Not at the current front line, not in response to immediate threat, but 30 kilometers behind terrain where fighting hadn't yet occurred. This is preemptive defense, positioning forces where the enemy will be rather than where the enemy is. And it requires accurate prediction of enemy intentions, combined with willingness to thin defensive lines elsewhere to concentrate forces at predicted decision points. British 10th Corps moved south to defend Meuse crossings on December 18th, a 48-hour redeployment that involved approximately 60,000 men and 15,000 vehicles. The movement was ordered by Field Marshal Montgomery, based on liaison with Eisenhower's headquarters, and represented the kind of inter-allied coordination that skeptics thought impossible, given Montgomery's difficult personality and complicated command relationships. The movement wasn't contested by German forces because German intelligence didn't detect it. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were grounded by weather, and German signals intelligence had lost track of British unit dispositions in the confusion of the offensive. By December 20th, British forces had established defensive positions, covering all major Meuse crossings from Givet north to Liège, positions that German forces would never approach closely enough to test. When I was cross-referencing German operational timelines with actual advance rates, I found it striking that the Germans were 90 kilometers short of their December 19th objective on December 19th. The 2nd Panzer Division, which penetrated furthest west, reached Celles on December 23rd, 8 kilometers from the Meuse, and 4 days late. 8 kilometers is simultaneously close and impossibly distant in military terms. Close enough to see the objective, distant enough that getting there would require breaking through prepared defenses with depleted forces that had already exceeded their logistical sustainability. The offensive had effectively failed on December 18th, when it became clear that advance rates wouldn't meet timeline requirements, but institutional momentum kept German forces attacking for another week. The village of Celles, where 2nd Panzer Division's advance stopped, provides a microcosm of the entire offensive's failure. The division arrived with approximately 40 operational tanks after losing more than half its armor strength to mechanical breakdown and combat losses during the advance. Fuel stocks were nearly exhausted, ammunition was limited, and no resupply was possible because Allied air interdiction had severed supply lines. On December 24th, the division attempted to continue advancing toward the Meuse, but was engaged by elements of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division with full fuel, ammunition, and air support. The engagement lasted 6 hours. 2nd Panzer Division was effectively destroyed as a combat formation. Aircraft from the 9th Air Force flew close support missions that delivered concentrated firepower impossible for ground forces to counter. The survivors retreated eastward on foot, abandoning vehicles that had run out of fuel or ammunition. Girox's staff calculated German advance momentum decay in a G3 analysis dated December 26th. The analysis used distance per day measurements to project that if the German advance continued at current rates, factoring in combat delays, mechanical breakdowns, and fuel shortages, forward elements would reach the Meuse on January 17, 1945. This is operational analysis as autopsy, determining that the patient was already dead, even though residual twitching suggested otherwise. The German offensive had lost 3.2 kilometers per day of momentum after December 18th, meaning each subsequent day of advance covered less distance than the previous day. That's not a temporary setback, it's exponential failure. And exponential failure curves don't reverse without dramatic external intervention that never came. Allied forces positioned 412 anti-tank guns, covering Meuse River approaches by December 20th. German intelligence, relying on outdated assessments from before the offensive began, estimated approximately 40 anti-tank guns in the sector. That's a 10-to-1 disparity in defensive capability, and it meant any German attempt to force a river crossing would have encountered prepared defenses that far exceeded what operational planning had anticipated. The technical challenge of conducting an opposed river crossing is immense, even with engineering support, adequate suppressive fire, and tactical surprise. The Germans had none of those advantages by late December, and any attempt to cross the Meuse would have been catastrophic. The engineering requirements for constructing a Class 40 pontoon bridge, capable of supporting 40-ton vehicles, under combat conditions, are worth examining because they reveal why the Meuse represented an impassable obstacle for German forces, even if they'd reached it. Construction requires approximately 19 hours, with a full engineer battalion working without interference, specialized bridging equipment that must be transported to the site, and continuous security against enemy interdiction. German engineer battalions in late December were depleted by casualties, lacked full bridging equipment due to transportation losses, and would have been working under constant artillery fire and air attack. The scenario was operationally impossible. To me, the most telling detail isn't the proximity of German forces to the Meuse, 8 kilometers at closest approach, but the certainty with which Allied commanders knew the Germans would never cross it. Giraud's map annotation from December 17th, "They won't get here," wasn't hope or bravado. It was operational assessment based on logistics capacity, movement rates, and defensive positioning. He was right. The battle that would have decided the campaign never happened because German forces couldn't reach the terrain where it would have been fought. This is what decisive victory looks like in modern warfare: denying the enemy the ability to engage on terms where they might win, positioning forces where prediction indicates threat will emerge, and letting operational friction, mechanical breakdown, fuel exhaustion, supply line interdiction, degrade enemy capability below combat effectiveness threshold. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered for dramatic last stands at places like Bastogne and St. Vith, but those defensive actions mattered primarily because they consumed German time and resources that the offensive couldn't afford to waste. The strategic outcome was determined by the bridges at Huy, Ardennes, and Givet that German tanks never reached, by British divisions that moved into defensive positions the Germans never tested, and by American artillery that never fired at targets that never arrived within range. Giraud's circle on the map, drawn on December 17th, marked the line where the German offensive would die. It did, 67 kilometers short of that line, having exhausted itself against secondary obstacles, while the primary defensive positions waited unused. Modern military doctrine calls this defeat in depth, layered defenses that impose cumulative costs until offensive capability collapses. The Germans beat themselves against the first layer, and never reached the second or third, and certainly never reached the Meuse River bridges, where the real defense had been prepared. The battle that wasn't fought was the battle that mattered most. Chapter 14, The SS Officer's Letter. The letter is written in pencil on the back of a fuel requisition form. The printed columns for quantity requested and authorization left blank because there was no fuel to requisition and no authority that could provide it. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper composed this letter to his wife Sigurd on the evening of December 20th, 1944, at Le Glaise, a Belgian village where his Kampfgruppe had been surrounded after advancing further west than any other German unit during the offensive. The letter, intercepted by U.S. intelligence when Peiper surrendered 4 days later, is catalogued in OSS records at the National Archives as evidence of German morale collapse. The opening sentence reads, "Sigurd, I do not think I will see you again." Peiper was among the most decorated Waffen-SS officers on the Western Front in late 1944. Holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, veteran of the Eastern Front campaigns, where brutality had been both policy and practice. His Kampfgruppe, battle group, was composed of elite SS Panzer Grenadiers and tank crews, the kind of formation that Wehrmacht propaganda portrayed as invincible. The letter's admission of defeat coming from such a source was sufficiently remarkable that OSS analysts translated it within 6 hours of interception and circulated it through Allied intelligence channels as evidence that even ideologically committed German officers understood the offensive had failed. The letter describes Peiper's tactical situation with precision. "We have no fuel, no ammunition, no hope." Le Glaise contained approximately 800 German soldiers, 28 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 25 artillery pieces, collectively worth approximately $14 million in 1944 currency valuations. All of it would be abandoned within 4 days because Peiper lacked the fuel to evacuate equipment 15 kilometers to German lines. The immobilized armor at Le Glaise represented roughly 12% of the total German tank strength committed to the entire Ardennes offensive, effectively neutralized not by American firepower, but by empty fuel tanks. What makes the letter historically significant isn't the tactical admission of defeat. Situation reports from multiple German units by late December acknowledged similar problems. But Peiper's explicit statement that, "The plan was insane from the beginning. I said this in November. No one listened." This contradicts Peiper's official combat reports filed during the offensive, which maintained optimistic assessments and blamed setbacks on external factors like weather and Allied air superiority. The source conflict reveals cognitive dissonance at command level. Public reports maintained institutional narrative, even as private communications acknowledged operational failure. Peiper was lying in his official reports because institutional culture required optimism, and telling truth in private correspondence because psychological necessity required acknowledging reality. When I was examining Peiper's interrogation transcripts from early January 1945, I found it striking that he carried this letter with him during his retreat from Le Glaise, keeping it in his uniform pocket when he could have destroyed it. Interrogators noted the letter during processing and asked why he'd preserved a document that was essentially a confession of defeat. Peiper's response, according to the transcript, because it was true, and someone should know I understood we'd lost, even while we were still fighting. This is an extraordinary admission from a Waffen-SS officer, suggesting that maintaining personal honesty had become more important than protecting operational security or institutional reputation. The psychological mechanics of continuing to fight after recognizing defeat as inevitable interest military sociologists because they reveal how institutional momentum can override individual rationality. Peiper knew the offensive had failed by December 20th, 5 days into the operation, and 6 days before Hitler would officially acknowledge failure. Yet his unit continued attacking until surrounded and out of ammunition. Orders continued flowing from higher command, and subordinates continued executing those orders, even though everyone involved understood at some level that the mission was impossible. This is what institutional inertia looks like. The Wehrmacht kept fighting not because victory was possible, but because the alternative, admitting defeat and ordering withdrawal, was psychologically and professionally unacceptable to senior leadership. German forces abandoned approximately $14 million worth of equipment at Le Glaise when Peiper ordered his men to retreat on foot on December 24th. The evacuation was conducted at night, with soldiers moving in small groups to avoid detection, carrying only personal weapons and minimal equipment. Approximately 770 of the original 800 men reached German lines successfully, a 96% survival rate that suggests American forces weren't aggressively interdicting the withdrawal. This wasn't mercy or tactical incompetence. It was rational prioritization. American commanders were more interested in capturing the abandoned equipment intact for intelligence exploitation than in inflicting casualties on retreating infantry. The letter's conclusion is brief. Kiss the children for me. Tell them I tried to do my duty. Peiper had 3 children by 1944, ages ranging from 2 to 7, and this is the only place in the letter where he references them directly. The phrasing is revealing. Not, tell them I succeeded, or tell them I fought bravely, but tell them I tried. It's an admission wrapped in familial duty, acknowledging that trying wasn't sufficient, but also asserting that trying was all that remained within his control. The letter ends without signature, as if Peiper couldn't bring himself to formalize the document, or perhaps ran out of space on the requisition form. To me, the most troubling aspect of this letter is that it humanizes someone responsible for the Malmedy massacre, and I find that deeply uncomfortable. Peiper commanded the Kampfgruppe when American prisoners were executed at Bonnier Crossroads on December 17th, and whether he directly ordered the massacre or failed to prevent it remains historically contested. Acknowledging that he was capable of accurate military assessment and genuine concern for his family doesn't absolve him of responsibility for war crimes. But historical analysis requires separating institutional evil from individual capacity for insight, and Peiper's letter demonstrates both. He understood the offensive was strategically insane, while simultaneously participating in its execution, which makes him neither sympathetic nor incomprehensible, just human in ways that complicate simplistic moral categorization. The letter was translated by OSS on December 24th and circulated to senior Allied commanders as an intelligence assessment. Eisenhower's chief of staff noted in a memo that Peiper's admission of defeat corroborates our assessment that German offensive capability is exhausted, and forces will begin withdrawing within 48 to 72 hours. That assessment proved accurate. German forces began systematic withdrawal on December 26th. An SS officer's private letter to his wife became intelligence product that informed strategic decisions, which is both darkly ironic and operationally appropriate. Peiper wrote truth because he thought he was dying. Allied intelligence exploited that truth because accurate enemy assessment was more valuable than propaganda. The letter exists at the intersection of private despair and institutional intelligence collection, a document that reveals more through its existence than through its content. Someone fighting a losing battle took time to write his wife that he knew they'd lost, and that act of personal honesty became evidence of strategic collapse. Wars end when enough individual officers acknowledge in private what no one in authority will admit in public. Peiper's letter was one of hundreds that marked that transition in the Wehrmacht during late December 1944, the moment when institutional narrative could no longer suppress individual reality. Chapter 15. The Fuel Depot at Stavelot. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin's investigation report, filed with Engineer Command in January 1945, contains one sentence underlined so heavily the pencil tore the paper. The fuel depot at Stavelot contained enough gasoline to move the entire German 6th Panzer Army to Paris. We left it unguarded. Pergrin commanded the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, responsible for defending river crossings and infrastructure in the northern Ardennes sector. And on December 17th, he discovered something that should have caused immediate panic at 1st Army headquarters. 3 million gallons of gasoline stored in jerry cans, approximately 2 kilometers from Stavelot, directly in the path of Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance, with 0 security personnel assigned to guard it. The fuel depot existed because 1st Army logistics planners in November had established it as a forward supply point for armored divisions preparing for the Roer River offensive. The location made sense for offensive operations, centrally positioned, accessible by major roads, large enough to support sustained fuel consumption during mobile operations. What logistics planners apparently didn't consider was what would happen if German forces attacked through the sector, and the fuel couldn't be evacuated quickly. Or perhaps they did consider it, and concluded the scenario was too unlikely to warrant contingency planning. Either way, the result on December 17th was catastrophic near miss. The single largest fuel concentration in the Ardennes sector sat undefended 2 hours' drive from German tanks, specifically tasked with capturing Allied fuel supplies. Pergrin received word that German armor was approaching Stavelot at 1500 hours on December 17th. 33 hours into the offensive. He immediately drove to the fuel depot to assess the situation and discovered what his investigation report describes as complete absence of security or evacuation procedures. The fuel was stored in 5-gallon jerry cans, stacked in open fields, organized by fuel type, diesel in one area, gasoline in another, with minimal weather protection and absolutely no defensive preparation. Pergrin's first instinct was correct. This fuel needed to be destroyed immediately before German forces could capture it. His second realization was worse. He lacked the time and resources to destroy 3 million gallons before Peiper's tanks arrived. The confrontation between Pergrin and 1st Army quartermaster officers over destroying the fuel depot is documented in meeting notes preserved with the investigation report. A quartermaster colonel argued that destroying the bridge into Stavelot would cut off fuel deliveries to 1st Army units conducting offensive operations toward the Roer dams. Pergrin pointed out that German intelligence summaries showed enemy armor 8 kilometers from Stavelot. The quartermaster's response: 8 kilometers is sufficient distance for evacuation if necessary. Pergrin's response is recorded as profane and emphatic, military bureaucratic language for what was probably an accurate assessment of institutional paralysis delivered with appropriate urgency. Pergrin ordered his engineers to set demolition charges on the Stavelot Bridge at 16:30 hours on December 17th, over the objections of quartermaster officers who wanted the bridge maintained for supply traffic. The charges were standard M1A1 demolition blocks, approximately 60 pounds of TNT, configured to drop the bridge's central span into the river. Pergrin's engineers completed placement by 1700 hours and waited for orders to detonate. Those orders didn't come immediately because 1st Army headquarters was still debating whether bridge destruction was premature. The debate continued until 0600 hours on December 18th, when Peiper's lead elements entered Stavelot from the east and began moving toward the bridge. When I was examining the source conflict between 1st Army logistics directives and field commanders' actions at Stavelot, I found it striking that institutional priorities were inverted by peacetime thinking. Logistics officers prioritized maintaining supply lines for planned operations, even after those operations had been suspended due to German attack. Field commanders like Pergrin recognized that preventing German forces from capturing 3 million gallons of fuel was more strategically important than preserving supply infrastructure for operations that weren't happening. The disconnect wasn't incompetence. It was institutional culture that couldn't pivot quickly enough from offensive planning to defensive crisis management. Pergrin's engineers detonated the Stavelot Bridge at 0617 hours on December 18th, 3 minutes after Peiper's reconnaissance vehicles came within visual range. The bridge's central span collapsed into the Amblève River, creating an impassable obstacle that forced Peiper to search for alternate crossings. More importantly, the bridge destruction isolated the fuel depot on the east bank, where American engineers could defend it or destroy it without worrying about German tanks immediately overrunning the position. Peiper withdrew from Stavelot by mid-morning on December 18th, unable to cross the river and unwilling to waste time forcing a contested crossing when his mission required speed above all else. The 3 million gallons at Stavelot represented 72% of the fuel Peiper needed to reach the Meuse River, according to his own consumption calculations. Capturing that depot would have extended his operational range by approximately 140 kilometers, potentially enough to reach his objectives before Allied forces could establish defensive positions. The fuel was American 80-octane gasoline, not ideal for German diesel engines, but usable in modified form or in captured American vehicles. Peiper's after-action report, filed before his surrender at La Glaise, specifically mentions Stavelot Fuel Depot as a missed opportunity that would have changed everything. He was probably right. Pergrin's investigation concluded that the fuel depot should have been evacuated on December 15th, 2 days before German forces approached, based on intelligence warnings that Dixon had filed predicting German offensive preparations. The fuel could have been moved using available transport. Approximately 600 tanker trucks were operating in the 1st Army sector, and evacuating 3 million gallons would have required 48 hours with existing capacity. Instead, the fuel remained in place because no one thought the Germans could penetrate that far, according to the investigation's final assessment. This is institutional failure in its purest form. Accurate intelligence was available, resources for action existed, and decision-makers chose not to act because the threat seemed improbable. To me, the most disturbing aspect of the Stavelot fuel depot incident isn't that it almost happened. It's that Allied commanders learned nothing from it. Similar near-miss incidents occurred throughout the Bulge. Ammunition dumps evacuated hours before German capture. Supply depots abandoned so hastily that equipment manifests were incomplete. Field hospitals moved with wounded still in surgery. Each incident represented catastrophic logistics planning that succeeded only because German forces were too disorganized or fuel-starved to exploit American vulnerabilities. The Allies won the Bulge despite making errors that should have cost them the battle, and the victory narrative obscures how close those errors came to producing disaster. Modern supply chain management uses adversarial stress testing, deliberately simulating enemy action against logistics networks, specifically because the Stavelot incident demonstrated that peacetime assumptions fail catastrophically under combat conditions. Amazon's logistics AI, which optimizes delivery routes and warehouse positioning, runs millions of simulations that military analysts call Stavelot scenarios. What happens when your most critical supply depot is suddenly threatened by forces that weren't supposed to exist in that area? The answer in December 1944 was institutional paralysis, hurried improvisation, and success that depended on enemy mistakes rather than Allied competence. Pergrin blew the bridge, saved the fuel from capture, and probably changed the battle's outcome. His reward was an investigation that documented institutional failure while he and his engineers were still defending the sector. The report's underlined sentence, "We left it unguarded," is an accusation that names no specific guilty party because the guilt was systemic, distributed across planning staffs and logistics officers who'd assumed the Germans couldn't reach Stavelot and therefore didn't need to plan for its defense. They were wrong, and they were lucky, and the difference between those two conditions determined whether Kampfgruppe Peiper captured enough fuel to continue toward the Meuse or died immobilized at La Glaise with empty tanks. Pergrin's engineers made that decision, not through brilliant planning, but through urgent recognition that errors needed fixing immediately, regardless of institutional objections. Sometimes, the difference between victory and defeat is one lieutenant colonel willing to destroy a bridge over a quartermaster's objections. And sometimes, that's the most honest account of how wars are actually won. Chapter 16, The Collapse Vector. Colonel Oscar Koch's intelligence summary for 3rd Army, dated January 3, 1945, contains a hand-drawn graph showing German retreat velocity across the previous 8 days, 2.1 kilometers per day from December 26th through 28th, increasing to 4.7 kilometers per day from December 29th through 31st, then jumping to 8.3 kilometers per day from January 1st through 3rd. Beside the graph, Koch had written, "This is not an army, this is dissolution." Koch served as Patton's G2 intelligence officer, responsible for assessing enemy capabilities and intentions, and his graph documented something that official German records tried to obscure. The Wehrmacht wasn't conducting a fighting withdrawal from the Bulge. It was experiencing organizational collapse, measurable through accelerating retreat rates that indicated institutional coherence had failed. German forces began withdrawing from Bastogne on December 26th, not through coordinated orders from Army Group B headquarters, but through local initiative by division and regimental commanders, who recognized their positions were untenable. Koch's intelligence section tracked the withdrawal by counting abandoned vehicles along retreat routes, using aerial reconnaissance photography to establish baseline counts that were updated daily. The initial count on December 27th showed 47 abandoned vehicles per kilometer of retreat, a 300% increase from vehicle abandonment rates during earlier German withdrawals in France during August and September. Abandoned vehicles weren't being destroyed or disabled, they were simply left where they stopped, often with fuel in tanks and ammunition in storage, because crews lacked time or resources to conduct proper abandonment procedures. December 28th marked an inflection point in German command coherence. A Corps commander's order intercepted by Allied signals intelligence contained phrasing that Koch noted as unprecedented. Units will retreat in good order. This was the first German order Koch's team had intercepted that used the word retreat rather than euphemisms like reposition, defensive adjustment, or retrograde movement. The linguistic shift indicated psychological acceptance of defeat at command levels, an acknowledgement that the offensive had failed and survival now required withdrawal, regardless of how that withdrawal was characterized in official communications. When I was examining Koch's methodology for calculating formation cohesion loss, I found it striking that he was quantifying something military analysts had previously treated as qualitative assessment. Koch defined cohesion loss as the percentage of German units that could no longer communicate with higher headquarters through any means, radio, courier, telephone. By monitoring Allied interception of German communications and tracking which units were transmitting, Koch could identify which units had gone silent. Some silence indicated radio discipline or equipment failure, but sustained silence across multiple units in a sector suggested command and control breakdown. Koch's calculation for January 2nd showed 67% cohesion loss across German forces in the Ardennes, meaning 2/3 of German units couldn't coordinate with higher command, even if they wanted to. The source conflict between Hitler's directive and field commanders' actions on December 28th reveals institutional paralysis at the highest levels. Hitler issued orders demanding hold all positions and threatening courts-martial for commanders who authorize withdrawal. Field commanders were issuing withdrawal orders regardless, either ignoring Hitler's directive or claiming they'd never received it due to communication disruptions. This is the moment when institutional authority collapses, when subordinates discover that disobeying orders produces better survival outcomes than following them, and when enforcement mechanisms are too degraded to punish disobedience. German equipment losses during the retreat from the Bulge exceeded losses during the offensive phase by substantial margins. Koch's analysis, finalized on January 16th after German forces had retreated to their start lines, documented 412 tanks abandoned during retreat, compared to 267 destroyed during offensive operations. The disparity reflects logistics collapse. Advancing units that lost tanks to combat could sometimes recover and repair damaged vehicles, while retreating units that lost tanks to mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion simply abandoned them because recovery assets no longer existed or couldn't reach disabled vehicles before Allied forces overran positions. Koch's projection that the Wehrmacht would collapse entirely within 90 days of January 3rd, meaning by early April 1945, proved accurate within 2 weeks. Germany surrendered on May 8th, 125 days after Koch's assessment, but effective military resistance collapsed in late March when the Remagen Bridge was captured and Allied forces crossed the Rhine in strength. Koch's calculation was based on attrition mathematics. If German retreat velocity continued accelerating at current rates, and if formation cohesion loss continued increasing linearly, the Wehrmacht would reach a point where it could no longer function as a military organization capable of coordinated defense. That point arrived in March, exactly when Koch's exponential failure curves predicted. The technical precision of Koch's analysis is worth examining because it demonstrates how intelligence assessment had evolved from qualitative judgment to quantitative modeling by late 1944. Earlier war intelligence relied heavily on intuition and pattern recognition, experienced officers assessing enemy capabilities based on similar historical situations. Koch instead used measurable indicators: retreat velocity, vehicle abandonment rates, communications intercept frequency, and prisoner surrender rates. These metrics could be tracked over time, graphed, and used to identify trends that qualitative assessment might miss. Modern conflict forecasting uses identical methodologies, with more sophisticated data collection but fundamentally the same analytical framework. To me, the most telling detail isn't Koch's graph itself, but the confidence with which he declared, "This is dissolution." That's not tentative assessment or hedged prediction. It's categorical judgment that the Wehrmacht had transitioned from organized military force to armed mob in the process of disintegration. Koch was right, and his confidence came from metrics that showed exponential acceleration in failure indicators. Linear decline can be managed, exponential decline cannot. The Wehrmacht had entered exponential failure, and Koch recognized it while German commanders were still issuing optimistic situation reports, claiming temporary setbacks and regrouping for renewed offensive operations. The Battle of the Bulge consumed Germany's last strategic reserve, approximately 200,000 men, 600 tanks, and operational fuel reserves sufficient for approximately 3 weeks of mobile combat. The offensive achieved nothing except accelerating Wehrmacht collapse that might otherwise have occurred more gradually over subsequent months. Hitler ordered the attack, knowing it would consume Germany's remaining military capacity, choosing symbolic desperation over rational delay. Koch's analysis proves Hitler's gamble failed catastrophically. The offensive didn't prolong the war or improve Germany's negotiating position. It destroyed the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct sustained defensive operations, and ensured Allied victory would come months earlier than it otherwise might have. Koch's final assessment, submitted to 3rd Army headquarters on January 16th, concluded, "The Wehrmacht is combat ineffective as a strategic force. Remaining units retain local tactical capability, but cannot coordinate operations above division level. Enemy will continue fighting, but cannot prevent Allied advance except through terrain advantage and temporary concentration at critical points. Recommend planning for exploitation operations toward the Rhine, with expectation of minimal organized resistance." This assessment guided 3rd Army's subsequent operations during February and March, and its accuracy was validated by the speed of Allied advance once offensive operations resumed. The Wehrmacht that fought at the Bulge was the Wehrmacht's last gasp. Koch was among the first Allied officers to recognize this with sufficient confidence to base operational planning on that recognition. His collapse vector analysis wasn't just intelligence assessment. It was autopsy report filed while the patient still technically lived, but had already experienced catastrophic system failure, from which recovery was mathematically impossible. Chapter 17. The Last Photograph. The photograph measures 8 inches by 10 inches, standard U.S. Army Signal Corps format for combat photography in World War II, printed on matte finish paper that has yellowed to cream over 8 decades. It shows approximately 340 German prisoners of war marching in a ragged column past a destroyed Tiger II heavy tank near St. Vith on January 16, 1945. The tank's turret number, 213, is still visible despite fire damage to the chassis. In the foreground, a German soldier has stopped walking and turned to stare at the destroyed tank. An American military police officer, blurred by motion, is yelling at him to keep moving. The photograph is catalogued in the National Archives as photo number 111 SC198861, and it was taken by Lieutenant William Lewis, a Signal Corps photographer who described it 40 years later as the saddest thing I ever shot. Lewis took this photograph at 14:30 hours on January 16th, the day German forces completed their withdrawal to the start line of the offensive, exactly 1 month after the attack had begun. His caption sheet, filed with the photo, reads, "German prisoners, captured during Battle of the Bulge, marched to POW cages. They look relieved." That final observation, "they look relieved," appears to be personal commentary rather than official description, suggesting Lewis understood he was documenting something beyond standard POW processing. The men in the photograph aren't the haggard, desperate soldiers often shown in late-war German images. They're exhausted but organized, moving in formation, many still carrying personal equipment. They look like military personnel conducting an administrative movement, rather than defeated combatants under guard. The soldier who stopped to stare at the destroyed tank appears in several frames from Lewis's contact sheet, though only one image was printed for official distribution. Lewis later described the moment in an oral history interview conducted in 1982. He just stopped and stared at that tank, like he couldn't believe it was real, like he couldn't believe he'd survived. The MP was shouting at him to keep moving, but the German just stood there for maybe 10 seconds, staring. Then he turned and kept walking, never said a word. Those 10 seconds became the photograph, a moment of recognition, of psychological transition from soldier to prisoner, captured in the instant before institutional processing began. The source conflict between German POW interviews and Nazi propaganda regarding surrender provides context for understanding this image. German prisoner interrogations from January 1945 describe relief at capture as a common theme, with soldiers explaining they'd expected execution or abuse, but instead received food, medical care, and cigarette rations. Nazi propaganda depicted surrender as betrayal punishable by courts-martial for captured soldiers' families, creating psychological barriers to capitulation, even when tactical situations were hopeless. This photograph captures the moment when propaganda narrative collided with lived reality. The soldier staring at destroyed German armor while standing safely among American guards who weren't executing him. The photograph appeared in Stars and Stripes on February 2nd with the caption, "Hitler's Last Gamble Ends," standard military journalism reducing complex human experience to morale-building headline. Lewis noted in his oral history that wasn't the story. The story was those faces. Nobody looks like a warrior. They look like people who want to go home. He was describing what military sociologists call role transition, the psychological shift from combatant identity to prisoner identity, which requires abandoning military purpose and accepting dependence on enemy mercy. The photograph documents that transition in progress, visible in faces that show exhaustion, relief, and what might be guilt for surviving while comrades died. Between December 16, 1944 and January 25, 1945, 30,582 German soldiers surrendered in the Ardennes sector. That's a surrender rate of 4.1 times higher than the Western Front average during 1944, statistically significant enough to suggest the Bulge offensive produced psychological conditions that made surrender more acceptable than during earlier campaigns. Some of this reflected material conditions, better treatment by American captors than German propaganda had predicted, but much reflected exhaustion and recognition that Germany had lost the war, regardless of individual tactical outcomes. In 1989, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans used Lewis's photograph in an exhibition about the Battle of the Bulge. A visitor identified himself as the soldier in the foreground staring at the tank. His name was Klaus Becker, age 68, owner of a bakery in Stuttgart, Germany. He contacted the museum to request a copy of the photograph. Museum records note, subject states he does not remember the photograph being taken. He remembers the tank. It had belonged to his battalion's heavy company. He remembers stopping to look at it and thinking, this is over. He does not remember what happened next. That blank space, does not remember what happened next, is where military identity ended and civilian identity began. A psychological discontinuity so profound, it created literal amnesia for subsequent events. When I was examining Lewis's contact sheets from January 16th, I found it striking that this image was one of 43 photographs he took that day, and it's the only one showing a prisoner pausing to observe destroyed equipment. The other frames show standard POW processing, men being searched, organized into columns, loaded onto trucks for transport to rear area camps. This single image captures something the others don't: individual agency in a moment when individual agency should have been completely suppressed by institutional control. The soldier chose to stop and look, despite MP orders to keep moving. That choice, however brief, was an assertion of autonomous judgment. This tank matters enough to risk punishment to observe it. To me, the most haunting aspect of this photograph is what it reveals about how wars end. Not with declarations or treaties, but with individual soldiers staring at destroyed equipment and realizing the abstraction called Germany, or the Third Reich, has become meaningless, while the concrete reality of their own survival remains paramount. Becker stopped being a German soldier in that moment. He became Klaus Becker, future bakery owner, survivor. The photograph captures that transformation in progress, literally frozen mid-step between military obligation and civilian future. Becker died in September 2024 at age 99. His obituary in the Stuttgarter Zeitung mentioned he'd served in the Wehrmacht during World War II, but provided no details about his service. His grandson contacted the National World War II Museum in October, having found Lewis's photograph while sorting family papers, and asked whether the museum knew anything about the image. A curator explained its historical context and sent digital copies of Lewis's contact sheets. The grandson's response, preserved in museum correspondence: "My grandfather never talked about the war. Now I understand why." This photograph shows the moment he stopped being a soldier and became human again. That's what this battle was, the moment history replaced myth. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945, when Allied forces re-established the frontline positions they'd held on December 15th. 31 days of combat, approximately 89,000 American casualties, 100,000 German casualties, and territorial gains that amounted to precisely zero after German withdrawal. The strategic situation on January 26th was identical to December 15th, except that Germany had consumed its final strategic reserves, and the Wehrmacht's ability to defend was irretrievably compromised. The offensive achieved nothing except accelerating Germany's collapse by months. But for Klaus Becker, pausing to stare at Tiger II-13 on a cold afternoon in January, the battle achieved something personal and inexpressible: survival. The opportunity to become someone other than a soldier. The chance to live long enough to own a bakery and raise children who would never know war. Lewis's photograph captures him in the moment of that realization. 10 seconds of stillness amid institutional momentum. One man asserting the right to observe what had been lost before accepting what would come next. The photograph has no military significance whatsoever. It reveals no tactical information, documents no important moment, advances no strategic understanding. It simply shows a human being stopping to look at the wreckage of the nation he'd served, recognizing it as wreckage, and choosing to keep living despite that recognition. That's what the Battle of the Bulge was. Beneath all the operational analysis and strategic assessment, hundreds of thousands of individual humans making individual choices about whether survival mattered more than ideology, whether going home mattered more than victory, whether living mattered more than the abstract concepts that sent them to the Ardennes in December. For Becker, captured by Lewis's camera in mid-recognition, the choice was made. Tiger II-13 was destroyed. Germany was losing. He was alive. Everything else was details to be processed later by people whose job was writing histories about battles that, for the people who fought them, were primarily about not dying in cold forests far from home.